Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Town of Fairfield January 2017 regularly scheduled meeting. Would everybody please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance? And I'm going to ask our first selectman, the birthday boy, to lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance this evening.
Thank you, kind sir.
Yeah.
I pledge allegiance
To the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you for letting me prove I still know the words even at an advanced age.
Advanced state of decrepitness. Yes. All right. We have 4 items on our agenda this evening. The first are to, is this on? Yeah. To approve the minutes of our December 6th meeting. The second item is to hear and consider and approve the 2017 meeting schedule. This is a holdover item. The third item is to hear an update from the Holland Hill School Building Committee. They did provide an update to the Board of Education, or rather to the Board of Selectmen a few weeks back, and we wanted to hear that presentation as well as any additional information they were able to provide. And the third item this evening is to hear, consider, and act upon any other communications. I did, before this meeting, late last week, forward to all board members, through our clerk, some communication from the state regarding the state budget adjustments and a reduction to the tune of some $600,000 of state funding to our town relative to educational cost-sharing grants. We want to talk about that tonight, understand a little bit about what the administrations are doing in the current fiscal year, as well as what the implications may be to the next fiscal year related to those items. Do we have any questions, comments, or concerns? Before we get started, I want to wish everybody a happy new year, and a prosperous new year, and a healthy new year. And I also want to welcome Dr. Tony Jones for her first meeting with us this evening. Dr. Jones, thank you for coming tonight. I know you had a long day outside the town, and I can imagine you've had some long weeks. So welcome to the town. We look forward to working with you, and we look forward to hearing from you later on. All right. With that, I'm going to ask for a motion to put the minutes of December 6th meeting before us. Mr. DeWitt, do I have a second? Mr. Mottola, questions, comments, concerns regarding the minutes? Seeing none, I'm going to call for a vote on this item. All in favor? Opposed, abstentions, that item carries unanimously. All right, next item. To hear, to hear, consider, and approve the 2017 meeting schedule. Everyone's had this schedule for 5 to 6 weeks at this point in time. I've heard nothing back from board members. I know the schedule was circulated to the Board of Selectmen without issue. Any questions, comments, concerns on the meeting schedule? Let me put it before us first. I'm going to ask Mr. Brown. I'm going to second Mr. Mottola. The item is before us. Any questions, comments, concerns on our meeting schedule? Mrs. Leclerc.
I just noticed that there's no July or August meeting. Is that something you want to schedule and then we can cancel it later? Or it's just better not to schedule it at all?
We had made the decision in discussing it with the clerks and in looking back at our history over the last few years that really we have not needed either the July or August meeting, specifically due to the timing of the RTM
Okay.
as well. So we left it off. We could, of course, put a meeting back on, should it be required, something urgent come up in the course of the year. And at that point, we can do it at a date certain at that time. It gives us flexibility.
Okay. Fine
Thank
with
you
that.
for the question. Any other questions, comments, concerns? All right, seeing none, I'm going to ask for a vote to approve the 2017 meeting schedule. All in favor? Opposed? Abstentions? Thank you. As a follow-up to that item, I have asked Mr. Brown to discuss with our Chief Fiscal Officer and our clerk scheduling the departments for the budgets so that we can get that moving along so that all department heads will be informed as quickly as possible. Mr. Brown, that appears to be moving forward, is that correct? Can we report back on that at our quarterly meeting at the end of this month? Great, we can actually, do you have handouts, or we can hand them out next meeting or via email?
Via email. Via email before next meeting.
Okay, thank you very much.
It is prepared. It's just a matter of sending them out.
Excellent. All right, I appreciate that. The next item, item number 3, is to hear an update from the Holland Hills School Building Committee. Come on up. Thank you, Mr. Quinn. Before we get started, Mr. Tetra, if you'd like to come forward, I know you were part of the discussions on this. Happy to have you come up to the table. First of all, before we get started, I think that it's very important that we recognize up front the hard work and efforts of our volunteer building committees. It's not an easy job. There's a lot of work, effort, pain, heartache that goes into it. So I want to thank you first, from our board to yours, for your service. It's greatly appreciated. Also want you to recognize that any questions, comments, concerns that are raised tonight are obviously not indicative of the work of the board or a criticism of the work of the board, but more so we're trying to understand the process and trying to make sure we get the best result, as you guys are, for the town. So I just want to put that on up front, because sometimes I think these meetings and these topics get emotional, and that people don't think that the hard work is duly recognized, and it certainly is by this body, by this board. So thank you.
Appreciate that, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Quinn, we'll turn it right over to you.
Okay. First of all, this is not personal, this is business.
Right.
Okay, I have no vested interest personally. Some weeks ago, we went before the Board of Selectmen to give them really a posting of where we're at. We had gotten,
Mr. Quinn, would you please use the microphone that's to your right? No, on your left, to your other right.
good gracious,
There we go.
That's better.
Go right ahead.
I think now we're getting personal. But, no, we went before the Board of Selectmen and gave them a posting as where we're at. When we did so, we had gotten our budgeting numbers just within, I guess, 8 days of that meeting. So it wasn't much time to really look at them. However, I got to tell you, it was sticker shock from the committee, from everybody, as we looked at them, and it came out to a number of $21 million. And obviously, that created quite a stir on the committee. So a lot of the things that we've been doing since then have been to work with the Board of Ed in terms of looking at all the assumptions that were put in and what was put into the plan and what can be done to change those assumptions. So that as you look at the stuff I sent you, it's quite obvious that the scope versus Riverfield is higher. And that's one of the major causes of the variation. Okay, I mean, when you have some kind of a differential, it's either volume, rate, or mix. Okay, and that's the way life has always been. And the volume here has gone up versus Riverfield. Now, in all fairness to Riverfield, Holland Hill was smaller to begin with. Okay, so we had to even catch up. There was 2,000 square foot difference. But beyond that, as you take a look at what we did at Riverfield, that was really the key areas that we looked at doing at Holland Hill. The same thing in terms of resource units and so forth. As we sat with the Board of Ed after the BOS meeting, we took a look at the assumptions and what we did, and we were working on restructuring those. So, I did some analysis on these numbers, but they don't mean anything in reality, because that's not going to be the number. We're in the beginning of the process. Okay, it's not going to be $21 million. By the time we finish going over all the individual changes, it's my guess that it's going to be minimally a 10% change, more in the neighborhood of 15%. So, but until we get hard numbers,
Mr. Quinn, a 10% change.
is over $2 million.
Okay, so a 10% to the 21 million,
Yes,
not a 10% to the approved, which is, as I recall, roughly 13 million.
That's a number that's been bantered, yes.
That's actually the number that was approved, I think.
Well, that was in the waterfall chart. That's not the number,
Right,
yes. Okay?
yep.
And that's very similar to what we had at Riverfield.
Right, Riverfield came in at what number?
Before the PCBs, 14 and a half.
Right,
I'm sorry,
before the PCBs.
Before the PCBs.
Before.
Not after the PCBs.
16.6.
Okay.
Yeah, there was a PCB issue that, over and above what I'll call the ed spec price.
Yep.
Ed spec estimate is 14.4, I believe, 14.5
Yeah,
is
14.
Mr. Quinn said. During the project, PCBs were discovered within the walls of the gym, and the EPA, after a long discussion, still required that we remove the gym and remove all the PCBs. And since we couldn't take them from outside, inside the walls, we literally had to knock the gym down. That cost another 1.8 or $2 million. That additional expenditure came back before all the boards focused. So in essence, the ed spec price was delivered on budget. It was a PCB add-on that caused the overrun.
And that really came from the Boston Regional Office that said, even though, it's in the walls and won't hurt anybody, it's, you need to change it either now or within the next 10 years. Obviously, if you already got everything there, you're not going to wait for 4 years and then bring everything back.
So just a level set. In the waterfall, we had 13 million. We've got numbers in front of us that are 21 million. You believe there's about $2 million worth of play
At minimum, yes.
at minimum, which would bring that down to 19 million, which is still 5 million over Riverfield, excluding PCBs and all that. And the 19 million or 21 million does not include any PCB remediation to date, correct?
Well, it includes about 400,000.
About 400.
Yeah,
Okay.
we have four.
Right? Do we know? Do we know of any, I know that we did PCP studies at all the schools at some point. I don't know how detailed, I forget. But do we know of any other potential PCB problems at Holland Hill just today?
No, we don't know for certain,
Okay.
okay, to answer your question.
Thank you.
The studies that were done indicated there could be some. I
Well,
went,
based on the years of construction relative to Riverfield, I think it's reasonable to
oh,
assume.
well, you got to understand, the gym here at Holland Hill, for example, was built in 76,
77, right?
okay, 76, 77, okay, and versus the gym, okay, was built in the late 50s.
That's not what it says on your schedule. It says major additions, gym, media center, and kitchen. It says Riverfield was done in 1971 versus 1977 for Holland Hill.
Okay, I made a mistake.
No, which was the reason for my, that
Yeah.
was why I jumped to the assumption that I did. Okay. Continue, I didn't mean to interrupt. Does anybody have any questions? I assume we're on this chart, Mr. Quinn?
Well, you can do, yeah.
Yeah.
What was the PCP removal number from Riverfield?
We budgeted at somewhere around $1.4 million, 1,470,
1.4, okay.
something of that nature.
Thank you.
Okay.
That was not in the original budget. That's
No,
what happened
right,
afterwards.
That's the actual.
Right. Okay, so looking at chart A1, anybody have any questions? I'll start over on the left-hand side. Mrs. Marmee and Mr. Hopkins. Mr.
I just have a question. The 10 to 15% that you're looking at is, we have some leeway. Just talk to me a little bit more about what you're basing that on.
Yeah, based on the fact that we're looking at the resource rooms, the amount of space for them, okay? And so we'll take a look and see if we can cut back on the space dedicated to resource rooms.
So the ed specs don't specify
No.
the resource rooms?
No.
So that's one. Is there any other give in terms of differential between the ed specs and what is in the plan?
Yeah, the park is site work was also part of the original ed specs, and we're looking at modifying that site work. The site work is very expensive.
So it's the actual addition of parking spaces, or is it
Parking
the
spaces,
entry? I know you're
both.
looking at both.
Actually, both. It's for the parents dropping kids off in the buses, as well as the incremental parking.
So has there been an actual study to look at the parking flow with the police or the drop-off, the safety, et cetera, or is that
That's in
to
the
be-
process. We have an outside consultant that'll be looking at that.
Okay, thank you.
So you know, this is schematic design, okay? This is not something dyed in wool. This is really an upfront estimate, okay? It is not meant to be put in stone. So, you know, you have to bear in mind that we were starting the process, and this is where we're at.
So just to follow up on that, I know that there's a lot of site work, there's more blasting to be done, for example, at Holland Hill than there was at Riverfield. Is the parking lot area, is that part of what needs to be blasted, or is that for the actual expansion of the school?
Yeah, my name is Peter Manning at Gilbane Building Company. There really isn't a lot of blasting anticipated at Holland Hill. The biggest cost driver on site is drainage and upgrades to the parking lot across the driveway from the school. That whole parking area was on the conceptual or on the schematic design was all upgraded. And as soon as you touch asphalt, you've got to address drainage with that. So it was a significant cost for the paving and the drainage.
One other note on that is the regulations governing drainage have changed since we designed Riverfield. So it's a more stringent standard now as well, requiring some additional drainage structures and volume.
Is that state?
State, yes.
So I have another question, just on the classifying Holland Hill as a 504 school. Is that playing into the cost factor of what you're looking at in terms of savings, not savings, or has the Board of Ed kind of weighed in on whether or not this is the way that they want to go forward with that?
This is what we have is 504. That's what all the school, Riverfield is 504.
So that's firm, we're going forward with that.
I would assume so. The Board of Ed can change, obviously, but right now, that's our task, is to deliver a 504.
Anybody else?
So you've determined, or the professionals have determined that the parking just, it needs to be upgraded for what reason? It's just old, basically?
A number of sites, for one thing. 63, I believe, is what we have currently at Holland Hill. And we were looking at to get it in the neighborhood of 90 to 100. In the original schematic design, we were looking at 128, I believe.
And I know you're going to be looking at it more closely, and I don't know if you can answer this question. Is there a parking problem at the school right now?
I would say yes.
There is, okay. All right.
Do we know there definitely is? Okay. I'm not asking, I heard somebody yell something out. I'm asking the person who's making the presentation.
Yeah, what I've been told, okay, I have not seen it myself. I've been told that parking is an issue.
In what way? Is it
In
staff
terms of,
parking? Is it visitor parking?
Well, having staff parking and visitors at the same time, okay, becomes a problem for the school.
All right. And how are you getting to the number that you need?
That was just, Board of Ed said they would like to have about 100 spaces there.
We'd like to have how many?
100.
That was in the ed spec?
No. I think ed spec was what?
The way the ed spec listed it was to expand the parking area, so it didn't give an exact number. So when we designed the site, here, we look to expand the existing side parking area here and also greatly increase the existing parking areas in this part of the site. Now, in the meetings that Mr. Quinn was referring to earlier that we had with the BOE since the BOS meeting, that's where we got a little more clarification on the magnitude of what they were hoping for, which is where the new figure of 90 to 100 spaces was mentioned, which is, as we continue to study through this process, we're going to refine this design to reduce it to that target number.
When you say BOE, are you talking about the Board of Education, of which Mr. Dwyer's here? I guess you can speak to that. Or are you talking about central administration, or are you talking about local staff at Holland Hill School?
With BOE, we met with Mr. Dwyer, Dr. Jones, Mr. Cullen, Mr. Morbido, to kind of examine, to examine the ed specs and our assumptions versus their assumptions, so we could start on an informed path to rein the scope and budget in.
Okay, did the Board of Education themselves vote on a certain number of parking spaces that they'd like to see there?
Not that, not that I'm aware of.
Okay, Mr. Dwyer, did they vote on it? Okay. Did you make a recommendation on how many spots there should be?
Central office staff did that the average number of spaces at our elementary schools are in the 95 to 100 range. The number comes from what is at most of the other elementary schools.
So you nor anyone from the Board of Education had no input into that? No. Okay, thank you.
Okay, Mr. Matala, did you have any other follow-ups?
No, not right now. Thank you.
Sure. We'll go to other board members with questions. Go to Mr. Walsh, did you have something?
Not at this point.
Anybody else? Mr. Brown?
In general, the ed specs, these are the ed specs right here. Are these the ed specs that, are these the original ed specs, or is there a deviation from the original ed specs?
Okay. Under the educational specifications and programming kind of master heading, on the left there are the original as-written educational specifications for Holland Hill, the ones that are currently approved. The next column to the right there had items that came out of programming meetings with school staff within the building committee to kind of figure out what other needs might be for the program. And that's, like one of the things that came out of that was an expanded scope of special education and resource spaces, or items like an expanded health suite. This is where we tried to also carry in lessons learned from the Riverfield project of what was wanted there versus what might be needed here, to try to put together what our understanding of would be a complete program for the project.
Okay, do you have a total cost of what the change was then? Of those changes, what the total cost was?
The total cost of
The additional.
I
The
don't-
additions to the ed specs.
I don't believe it was broken out to that level.
That was one of the requests from the Board of Selectmen meeting, was that those items that were over, beyond the spec, because that was mentioned, we asked for a breakout and what the cost was for those.
Yeah, I watched the Board of Select meeting, and Mike, you're correct. And one of my questions I had in general is, have you, at the Board of Selectmen, received any additional information that we don't have before us from the request that you made at your meeting?
Actually, I believe the items in your packet
Yep.
that were things that we requested for were only distributed to the Board of Selectmen through the Board of Finance backup. So I was going to check with my colleagues. But I was also coming here to see if there's any additional information that came out tonight, so we could get back to the Board of Selectmen with a full packet.
Because you seem to ask for certain drivers that we're talking about right now, and I don't see them in the packet.
No, the drivers are there.
So when we get to when we talk about the health space and the differences with the, between one school and the other with the special education space?
Yeah, we didn't go deep down, drill down on every resource, Mr. Walsh. What we did was say, the existing building, new addition, heavy renovation, light moderate renovation, and the cost differentials due to site work, plumbing and HVAC. I mean, those were all the key drivers.
What about, to the point though, any additional functionality or differences in number of classrooms, special ed needs, things of that?
We outlined there is space of 3,325 square foot of resource rooms that were not listed in the ed specs,
Okay.
okay? The ed specs,
Are they at Riverfield?
yes, they're in there.
So they're in Riverfield, and now you're adding them into the ed specs in Holland Hill, is that correct?
That's correct. The ed specs for Holland Hill did not include a lot of the resource spacing.
And so the building committee added that in their initial...
As we met with the principal, teachers,
Do we have a listing of those items, I guess is what people are asking for, things that were
What?
not in the ed specs?
I
that
think
were-
that was the Board of Selectmen request, that we have a
Right.
list of those,
We
but
should get
also
that.
priced
And
out,
maybe it's
so
in
we
here, just
know,
not labeled, that I know.
so we know what the cost of those decisions were, since they weren't made by the Board of Ed, and they weren't in the ed specs, so we know what the cost over and above the ed specs are.
Yep.
Okay, so that, you got the same question, and we'll get that information?
and we'll get that information.
Okay.
Can I-
Mr. DeWitt?
Clarify one thing.
Yeah, real quick.
I just want, the gentleman on the right, I just don't know who he
Oh, I'm
is.
sorry, please, go ahead, Andrew.
That's okay.
In the mic, please?
Oh, sorry. Brian Stone, Kenneth Borson Architects.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. DeWitt, you had a question?
Just a clarification. On this chart, is the 21 million estimate based on the column that's called proposed 504 capacity school?
Yes.
Okay. There is something in the back of your package, chart B1 and B2, that says things like not in ed spec, but I don't know if that's the total, not in ed spec. And I guess I don't know
So-
if it's appropriate for this meeting or not. I just don't understand the process of, you get handed an ed spec. Here you go build a school to this, and then it completely changes. I'm lost at that, how that process works.
Okay. Well, let's start with chart B2.
Okay.
This outlines the number and type of special education spaces that came out of our programming meetings, which if you look on this large chart here, under the educational specifications and programming block, that middle column is where you can see the breakout of what was in the ed spec versus what was added. So you can see how under special education resource rooms, there was one special education kind of classroom called out in the ed specs, but as we dug into the programming of it, that's where we saw, instead of a 800 square foot special ed room, it would be better to potentially have 4 200 square foot special education classrooms, where you'd want things like language arts and speech rooms, or English as a learned language spaces, OT, PT, things like really fleshing out the needs. So something like chart B1, this takes a similar track to what we're trying to show on this large chart here, as far as what was already in the document, what wasn't in the document but was identified as a need.
So in B1,
Need or a want?
thank you, that's where I was just going.
Sorry,
No, go ahead.
a need or a want?
For items like the special education classrooms, it was presented to us as this was to address the programs that they wanted to have in place to meet
That they wanted to have?
student needs.
Okay, well, what I want to know is, there's ed specifications, which are needs, and then there's these program specifications afterwards, which are needs or wants.
Okay.
What are they?
What I would, let's see. There you go, Tom.
One of the issues with the ed specs, if you take a look at chart B1,
Chart B1?
yep,
Okay,
okay, there's a whole big block, a number of them say not in ed spec. I'll give you one in the middle of the page. Instructional improvement teacher's office, school psychologist office, language arts specialist, nurse's facility for staff, separate toilet, large conference room, things we did at Riverfield, not in the ed specs. Okay? Speech and language, OTPT, there was nothing listed in the ed specs.
so what's the process, thank you, what's the process when You get the ed specifications, you go through, and you say, oh, sorry, thank you. That's probably the first time in 12 years you've had to say that. Yeah, I know, right? What's the process when this happens? Because essentially what you're doing is redefining the ed specs. Or creating additional ed specs. So then what's the process that goes through when that happens? Does this go back to the Board of Education for revision?
Well, it would always go back to the central office as we discuss the numbers, okay, and where the numbers derive from. Again, this is early in the process,
Right,
okay? This is a schematic design.
right.
We wanted to know how much money was there if we did these specs that we met with. These were not
Right.
just picked out of the sky.
No, I understand that, and I wouldn't have never thought so. My concern is that we had an estimate of 13 million, right, for planning purposes, which, let's say that estimate should have been closer to 14.5 million, because that's what Riverfield ended up being, for planning purposes. We're now at 21 million, and even though we're in the early stages, what I'm hearing from you guys as representing the committee is, hey, we think there's about 10% of play in this, which still has us at 19 million, which is still a huge difference from 14.5 million. So even if we're just in that planning phase, it's still a big problem, if that 10% is right.
Well, I'm not sure it is right. I have to put something down as, you know, because I know that question will be asked.
Right.
However, being a conservative nature, I'm not sure it's 10%. But I can tell you we're working towards getting a reasonable number.
Right.
And if that's 20%, that's what it will be.
Yeah, and I know you guys are. I can see that. Can we go back just for a second? Because I'm trying to make heads or tails of the chart. Can we go to chart A1, a minute, which was the chart we started on? Right? Now, bear with me for a second and see if I can do a little cocktail napkin math and just tell me where I go wrong, as I undoubtedly will. I'm going to say we're going to level set at Riverfield number, which is 14.5 million, for sake of argument. All right? Then if I read on here, the two big drivers are plumbing and HVAC, right? It's about $800,000 differential, if I'm reading this chart correctly.
Correct.
All right. And then the new addition area, I'm reading that that's about $1 million more, right?
Yes.
So that brings my 14.5 up to 16.3. Right? All right. So then, I don't know what heavy renovation versus light renovation means. And the only other item I see is, or big item, is your site, the site work you have listed here, the 300 and some odd thousand. Is that the parking lot related that you were speaking to?
Yes.
That's
Parking lot
additional.
and drop-off.
Okay, so I'll even give you that, because that I understand there's differences. So that brings us up to like 16.7 million. Is that fair? I mean, what am I missing? What's the renovation? What's the, okay, there's heavy renovation, there's light to medium, maybe they offset each other?
Yeah, basically they do.
Okay. So,
This is at trade cost level,
this is at what?
trade cost.
Okay.
It is
Explain-
not project cost.
Okay, explain that to me, please.
So the trade cost is basically what the cost of the construction is. It does not include soft costs, which are consultant fees, owner contingency,
Testing, inspections.
testing, inspections, those sorts of things.
Well, we had those all at the other building, so why should they be any different at this building? I'm doing the differential here. Those shouldn't be different between Riverfield and Holland Hill. Why would they be?
Well, I'll give you one good reason. It's called, this was done in 2014 for Riverfield, okay?
You're going to say that there's an inflationary.
Oh, yes,
Okay, so what's the inflationary factor?
okay. The inflationary factor used here is 4%
4% a year.
a year.
4% a year. Oh, it's a good business. Okay, so 8% more.
Okay, and we've gone back out and checked with various,
Mr. Chairman, it's actually over 8 years. Riverfield, I'm sorry, 4 years, not 2 years. Riverfield was bid in 14.
Yep.
The start of construction is anticipated to be 18 here.
So you're saying
So-
it's a 16%? Is that what you're saying?
Correct.
So you upped it by 16%? Yes, go right ahead.
Not to pile on, but if we have an actual number for PCP removal from Riverfield, I don't see any reason why that number shouldn't roll into every project going forward. And the difference between that number and the number you've got budgeted is $1 million. So there's an extra million in there. Well, why are you shaking your head?
The part of the issue at Riverfield with the PCB removal
Yeah?
was the fact that we had to demolish the gym and build a new one, because the PCBs were between the exterior and interior walls. They could not be removed. The EPA wouldn't let us keep them there under any circumstances. So in other PCB removal situations, like at Osborne Hill, we're not necessarily destroying the gym.
But how much did Holland Hill cost us?
Holland
I
Hill
mean,
hasn't cost
Osborne
us
Hill.
anything yet.
Osborne Hill.
It depends on where the PCBs are and what's taking place. And off the top of my head, I don't know.
You know what, here's my point. We always do these numbers, like these waterfall numbers. Well, we think it's 400,000. It ends up being $1 million. They all go up. We have historical numbers, and I get you, they're not perfect, and nothing's perfect in this. But my experience over the last 10 years is every time we touch a wall, something costs us $1 million for removal of something, whether it be asbestos or not. So when we have real numbers that are in the $1 million range, why would we put in a number for PCB removal less than $1 million? At this point, right now, why would we do that? It seems short-sighted, much to this gentleman's point, 4 years out from actual construction. A year and a half now, but when they did the actual estimate.
So I come up with, if I do 16, you're saying a 16% cost increase. So it goes up to 16.8 million plus 2 million, 18.8 million?
that's probably about right, about $19 million. And you ought to know that nobody at this table, okay, really did the cost estimates. Cost estimates are done by a third party hired by the architect, and the cost estimates are done in-house by Gilbane, okay, who has a cost estimating department. And they take whatever the schematic design is and then estimate a cost for 2018-19, okay? And that's what they give us. Now, contrary to when we did Riverfield, we had the same process, and there was some $1.4 million differential between the two cost estimates. These were within 200,000, which was remarkable. And that included the inflation estimates and projections that we just gave you. It's done by separate people.
Yeah, no, I'm not saying they're wrong. I'm saying that we can't afford it.
I understand that, but I'm just saying, the derivation, the numbers didn't come from us.
Oh, yeah, no, I get that.
They came from outside. We went back out after the BOS checked out other ones, and Chuck, you did the checking, and it was from 3.5% to 4% for the outside companies.
Yes, that's correct.
What's the square footage of the resource rooms you added?
3,325
What's the cost per square foot?
averagely.
I think it's about 210.
250.
250, if it's new construction, it's a reduced amount if it's in the renovation area, so it's a convoluted. The average,
Say 225.
the average cost over the entire job was 205. That's trade cost. That does not include any soft costs.
Okay, so if we add the soft costs, 225?
225
Times 3,250 feet, is that what you said? So just in resource rooms added, not included in the ed spec, is like $730,000.
All right.
We'll go to Mr. Mottola, and then we'll go to Mrs. Marmy. He was first, sorry.
So if I'm understanding this, in order to get Holland Hill to be, for lack of a better term, equivalent to Riverfield, you're talking about a project of about 18 million and change.
That's correct.
Okay. Is Riverfield, maybe the Board of Ed can answer that, is Riverfield a 504 school? Does it have the same classroom size and other rooms that, let's say, McKinley has or Burr School has, other 504 schools? Or does it have more than those other schools, if you know? And my question is kind of general there.
I can tell you it's a 504,
I know McKinley is, and I know Burr is a 504.
and so is Riverfield.
My question is, I'm going to be using the wrong terminology, and I don't mean any disrespect, but it seems to me that when Riverfield was built, you correctly listened to the Board of Education, the professionals, and added some extra space. I'm not going to call it bells and whistles, but what you determined, what the Board of Ed determined to be necessary space, that was a little bit over and above the original Board of Ed spec. Is that correct?
For Riverfield?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Not much, but a little.
And I know it's not much. So the question I have is, to your knowledge, and maybe we can get an answer later from the Board of Ed, for example, does the Burr School have the same number of special education resource rooms that Riverfield has, to your knowledge? That McKinley has? You know, that type of thing. Yeah, because, and I understand what you're doing here. You want to build a school that's equivalent to the last school that you built, which is Riverfield School. You want it to be comparable, Holland Hill and Riverfield, and I certainly understand that. And maybe things have changed since Burr and McKinley have been built. And in fact, I know they've changed, because that's been a good 10 years plus already. So, maybe we can get that information at some point from the Board of Education.
Yeah, yes, I think that's appropriate. You ought to also understand the demographics change by school,
Sure.
okay? And the things that we did with Riverfield were not just transparently carried over to Holland Hill, but were based upon what their needs, as they told to us, in terms of special ed students, medical students.
Yeah, but Mr. Quinn, you're not building to what the demographics are today, right?
Well, I'm dealing to it,
Change,
well, but over a period of time. Okay, Holland Hill has been tight school for OTP, medical, and special needs students for a while.
Because of the number of students that require that?
Yes.
Do we have stats on that? Did the Board of Ed or Central Administration give you those statistics?
No, just
Okay,
the
if we can
local.
through you, Mr. Chairman, can you have Central Administration to provide those statistics for the last 10 years?
Please. Yes, Mrs. Leclerc.
To follow up on Jim's request, could we ask for, like, the 504 ed specs for all the schools? Like, because at the bottom of, hold on a second.
Your microphone and a little closer.
Yeah,
Sure. Just want to find.
seems to be a recurring theme tonight.
Okay, on the bottom of page, chart B1, it says that the ed specs were done differently for Riverfield and Holland Hill, but I would like to see what they are for the entire school and for the other 504 schools, to see that we've been consistent. And if something changes and a need changes over time, that's fine with me. I just want to kind of understand the process and what we're building towards.
Mr. Dwyer, do you want to, I do agree with Mrs. Leclerc's ask. Mr. Dwyer, representing the Board of Education, do you want to speak to how these might have been different, or was there a difference in process that the Board of Education went through for the ed specs for the schools? So I think it is relevant since we're comparing one to the other.
And have the ed specs on a 504 school changed over the last 10 years?
Good question.
I don't remember. Probably have.
Thank you and welcome.
The ed specs really go through kind of 3 steps.
Okay.
Within the long-range facilities plan that the Board of Education has passed, first, we say, what are the needs of the school based on enrollment projections? And so if it's a 504 school, that means it needs 24 classrooms times 21 students, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So first, we say, what are the needs of the school based on enrollment? And then...
not current enrollment, but the enrollment...
Enrollment
that we
based
want
on a
that
10-year,
to
yes,
handle.
based on a 10-year projection.
So, just to stop you right there, just for a second, you would believe that all 504 schools on that basis are similar?
What?
Similar,
Yes,
okay.
yeah. That you can't project that the correct number of families with the right age children are going to show up in that neighborhood perfectly every year. So generally, when we plan on a 504 school, we aim at an enrollment projection that is 90% of that number. So the 450 and the enrollment projection for Holland Hill at the moment, 10 years out, is 442, based on the latest projection. So that's how we determined whether it should be a 504 school or something else. So that's number one. Number two, in 2010, a management company came in and looked at our spaces relative to the number of children to be served and how many resource rooms are needed, how many square feet are needed for different program purposes, and put together a list of program deficiencies. And so whenever we're doing a major renovation of a project, after enrollment, we look at that list of program deficiencies and say we should correct the building based on program deficiencies.
And that's done at the Board of Education level, and that is, with the administration, and that is factored into the educational specifications that you people put forward?
Correct.
Okay.
And then the third is, I'll say, life safety and critical maintenance issues that have come up, whether it's the roof that we thought was going to last longer but is not going to, the boiler that we had hoped but will not. So those are the 3 things that our staff look at when they're putting together an ed spec.
Right.
It's not, we do very much want to have equity among the various schools.
Sure.
But we do those 3 things first in terms of creating the ed spec.
So, and I just want to point out, while you were saying specifically the second part about program deficiencies and the fact that that's factored in, Mr. Quinn, you were vigorously shaking your head.
That's right.
Go ahead.
But they were not listed.
Tom, you need a mic.
They took it away
It's right there, right in front of you. This one.
for obvious reasons. Yeah, now it's too much. Take that with me to my test. The ed specs in the future, what I was going to recommend at the end of this project, is the ed specs have to be more specific in terms if we do have program numbers for OTPP, whatever it is, that they list it in the ed specs. Because if they don't put it in the ed specs, the committee doesn't have it. And I gave in that deck, B1,
Yes, you did.
okay, the ed specs that we didn't have.
So you're implying
I'm not implying anything.
that these were deficiencies that the ed specs did not address that you're trying to address in the plan?
That we addressed,
I'm not trying to put words in.
no, we addressed it on a local basis,
Local basis, meaning working with the principal.
principal and their staff.
Got it. Mr. Walsh?
Mr. Dwyer, he's got a very good point. Why don't we have more specific ed specs when we know what we need in a 504, even with the program things you want to add? Why wouldn't your board vote on what those were so that when we have a 504 school, it should be pretty cookie cutter? We need, certainly we need space for a school psychologist office. Certainly we need maybe 2 language arts specialists, because that's what we need at Riverfield. Why wouldn't they be more specific and you be able to pull them right off the shelf and just give them to the committee?
Our existing buildings are all built at different times and exist on different sites. I think we have felt that a more generalized ed spec that allows the building committee to meet the ed spec given the existing conditions of either the building and/or the site.
It seems to give them a little too much power to determine your programming by determining how many rooms that they want for certain things, when you guys should be creating the program. It seems to me we have a 504, it should be a cookie cutter. You should know a bunch of these areas that were left out. We have an art room. They all have kilns in them. That we should know that we need that. I mean, there's a bunch of these things that are listed that seem, it's not based on the population. We're building to a 504. If we're building to a 504, we're building to a population, like you said, of 90% of that number. We don't know whether they're going to be there or not. There could be more, there could be less. But certainly, we're building to that number. So we should know, and we know we're doing an addition. So if we need more, if the facility's different, we'd have to add that space or not add that space. And the architects would have to plan accordingly. It just seems to me when we're going through this process, we should know, and from one school to the other, between, unless you're telling me something educationally has changed, or you guys on your board have voted for a different change in the product that we're delivering, this should be pretty easy to have more specifics on what this educational specification is. So, the committee doesn't have to go and start meeting with the Holland Hill community and the teachers and the administration and asking, hey, what do you guys want? Oh, it's going to be better here to have 4 split rooms of 200 as opposed to an 800 square foot room? I don't know whether that's the best idea. Maybe the Board of Ed has another reason why that shouldn't be done. I find it a little, I don't know, I just find it odd that it gets down to the building committee meeting with the local school, administration, principals, with all due respect, this should be coming from a higher level. Shouldn't be the tail wagging the dog.
I think one of the issues that I'm remembering a conversation 5 years ago when I think Rob Bolito asked, if we're going to do a school, shouldn't we do everything that is needed in that school so that we don't have to revisit the school for a long time? Our project budgets over time really have reflected the approval process of the town, which is what do we need to do for the next 10 years? And maybe it's back to Mr. Flynn's question, is this a need or a want? We have did not include into the ed specs the kind of heavy renovation of the existing building. That doesn't mean it's not needed. There's nothing that the building committee has proposed that can't be used by our school staff and aren't needed and would improve the quality of the education process that they've proposed. But our original ed spec was based on what do we need to meet the enrollment, to address the 2010 list of deficiencies, and the life safety immediate maintenance needs. So part of the question I think that you're asking is when you go beyond that and say, well, this is important as well, and this is important as well, and this is important as well. Those are all important things, but then you say, how much can we afford to spend at any one school, which then impacts our ability to do another school project. So those are part of the factors, I think, that end up part of the discussion.
I'm okay with that scenario if in fact there were key decisions made at key points. I think what Mr. Walsh gets to, and what I'm struggling with, is it sounds as though the ed specs weren't complete, and the building committee went to the local principal and whomever to complete those ed specs. And I guess it gets back to, well, I understand and appreciate your comments, Mr. Dwyer. It doesn't get to the point where it says, okay, every 504 school that we build will have 24 classrooms, 6 resource rooms, 2 art rooms, you know, all the way down, whatever. I'll leave that to better minds than mine to figure out. But, and then you sit there and you say, okay, here's what that looks like, and it's the same. And it doesn't sound like that happened in this case, if I'm hearing it correctly.
The style of the ed specs have been the same for building projects since I've been on the board. And for instance, we talk about 1.0 classroom for special education. That does not mean that we wanted one classroom of 800 square feet. We wanted 800 square feet available for special ed classrooms, and the building committee should design a project that accomplishes that based on the existing facility and what spaces can be used, and 200 might be better than, or 300. We leave those individual specific decisions to the building committee.
Well, yeah, I understand that, but there's a comment here, and Mr. Walsh, I'll go right back to you, but I'm just reading from the comment here, as seen in Chart B1, the Riverfield specs were more specific. In order to flesh out the ed specs, the committee and the architect met with HH staff and central board to fill in the program needs for Holland Hill. So that just implies that there was a difference in this process versus Riverfield. That's all. And that's all we can go by is what's before us.
I would have to have the, what you're looking at is a summary of the ed specs, not the actual ed specs. If you wanted to, you'd have to look at the Holland Hill ed specs as they were passed by the Board of Ed, the Riverfield ed specs as they were passed by the Board of Ed, and see how much of a difference there was in the way they were presented.
Mr. Walsh?
What I don't understand, Mr. Dwyer, about what you just said is, I understand you say you need 800 square feet of special ed space, but you don't seem to really care. Your board doesn't. You're the representative.
I'd rather have you not use the word "I don't care" because we care deeply about the service to our students.
But I don't understand how on a 504 you don't have a specific setup for how you want the special education space set up. So you're basically saying to Mr. Quinn, hey, you can either build one 800 square foot room, you could build 4 rooms of 200 square feet, or you know what? If you want, you can build 10 rooms of 80 square feet apiece.
Well, can I?
We don't really care based on our programming, and I don't understand how at this point in time.
And also, Jim,
I'm not done speaking.
My apologies.
But I don't understand how your experience with these other schools that we've been delivering 504s, this is not our first rodeo. I don't understand how you are living with these brand new, beautiful spaces we're giving on these brand new 504 schools that either at the administration level or at the board level, you don't know what you want. You just want 800 square feet of special ed space. But you're just going to leave it up to Mr. Quinn and his committee, who I don't know have the best expertise on how you're delivering your program. So it just seems odd to me that you're just relying on them, whether they're all building people or not, for delivering a specific program, a special education program, which we spend a lot of money on, and I think it's great, and I want these kids to all excel, but that we don't have some type of structure of how many rooms we want them to be, approximately what size do we want them to be, maybe even what will the state reimburse us for? What is the state saying the size of those rooms should be?
Should I respond to you or not?
Please. Sure.
The Board of Ed are not architects. We anticipate that the building committee and their architectural staff will consult with our central office building staff and work out the details to deliver the ed specs. We do not anticipate that they're off on their own without any guidance from our staff. We anticipate that the two will work closely together in delivering the ed specs so that we don't have 801 square foot rooms or any other combination. The Board of Ed is not an architectural firm. We think it is better to say, here's what we want in total. Let the professional architects and the building committee, working with our staff, work out the details.
Phil, can I add to that? I don't want to get hung up on the special ed 800 square feet, because a lot has to do with how the school is laid out, whether you can deliver 2 400s, 4 200s. It depends on the space available. And that's what the architects do. And they take a look what's available. And they also meet with the teacher and with the principal, how is best your programming? Do you want 4 200s? How do you want your 800 square feet? Because it depends upon the school, the school.
Mr. Quinn, does that happen with the principal and the teachers, or does it happen with central office?
It will happen to both, depending.
Okay, because you just referenced the principal and the teacher, so I just...
Well, this particular project, we spent a lot of time with the principal.
Really?
Yeah.
This is going to go, I have Mr. DeWitt, and then Mr. Becker, and then I'll come over. Are you done, Mr. Walsh?
No, I just find it surprises me that it's mostly the principal. It surprises me that it's not more central administration people. And Dr. Jones, if you think you're going to change that, I'd love to hear it, because it just seems to me that there should be, this should be being determined in-house and not by individual principals. And we've heard this before, and I'm not saying this is the first time we've heard this, that there's been extra things added at the end when there's extra money based on what certain principals want at their specific school. And I don't think I agree with that. I just think as a management, from a management standpoint, the managers are central administration and they report to the Board of Education, and that they should be laying out what the program is, not a specific principal.
You are aware this is not extra. We're talking about same 800 square feet. It's how it's divided. It's not extra.
Okay, but my other point is, why isn't it the same at each of the schools? I don't know why
That's
that's
a
not.
different question, yeah.
Yeah, that's a different question. It is a different question, but that's why I'm asking that. You mentioned that you found it better to have four spaces of 200 square feet apiece. Why isn't that the administration that's telling you that? In an ed spec.
Thank you. Let's go to Mr. DeWitt, who's been waiting patiently, and then Mr. Becker, who's been even more patient.
I'm in full agreement with Mr. Walsh's comments, but I don't want to talk about the allocation of 800 square feet. You quoted one of our former colleagues. He was absolutely right. We should do as much as we can. But I don't know how many building things I've been through in 10 years here, but I've never heard one school not say I need more OT-PT space. And that's not even in the ed spec. So forget about the allocation. The functionality isn't even in your ed specs. I mean, a nurse's facility, not in the ed spec. So the ed specs seem to be missing the basic functionality. Forget the square footage, how you do it, that's an architect's thing. I'm with you. The ed specs don't seem to meet the basic principle of what Mr. Belita was talking about, which was we have to give the functionality within the space. Within the space is the gentleman on the right.
They list the function, but not how big. That's what we're concerned about. Okay, they can say a nurse's office.
Right, but the ed spec doesn't even say nurse's office. It's only
that's what you say here.
it's only through the diligence of this building committee that you said, hey, by the way, what does Riverfield have? Oh, they have an OT-PT room. I guess we should add that. That's only through the diligence of your board. Your ed spec, which is supposed to be your guiding document, isn't even telling you the most basic functions that are required for the school. That's where my frustration is.
Is that true? That's what this implies. I don't know.
Well, okay.
Chuck?
Yeah, please, feel free.
Mr. Flynn, please. Mr. Quinn, you wanted to comment?
Chuck?
Mr. Flynn's not going to answer anything. 'cause I don't know. Maybe Mr. Quinn.
Using the health space as an example, we have a certain average size health space in our elementary schools. Our staff felt that the existing health space was adequate, again, under the concept of we need to get to 504, we need to get certain other deficiencies done, so we don't have the budget, if you will, to expand the health space. The building committee designed a health space within the existing 21 million. That's one of the subjects that we talked about at the Board of Ed that is roughly double the average health space that we have in other elementary schools. Using the kitchen as an example, our central office staff felt that what we needed in an addition for the kitchen was to meet the dry storage, refrigerator, and freezer space. They have a much larger kitchen renovation. And so it's not that we didn't anticipate those things, just that we were meeting the immediate needs.
It sounded like the Board of Ed is acting like an architect, what you just said a
No.
few minutes ago. OTPT. Where are you doing OTPT at the school today?
We asked for resource
Lady in the back
rooms.
was dying to answer.
We asked for resource rooms. Our ed specs are not specific, as some of you have commented on, because if the building committee says, well, because of the design of this building, we can't deliver 4 200-square-foot rooms, then they'd have to come back to us for every minor adjustment based on...
Not what
our
I'm saying.
specs. So
I'm saying functionality. The function of OTPT is not covered in ed spec. I'm just going to pick
in
on
this
that one thing.
particular ed spec, that's correct. Not
Okay.
specifically listed.
Can we get a clarification on that?
go ahead.
Can I, for a second, Chris?
Sure.
Not to interrupt, but I am concerned over something you just said. I want a clarification. So we have this document prepared by the building committee, right, Mr. Quinn?
Yes.
And it says that
Chuck,
there's...
you got to talk to that.
And there's things that are listed as not in the education spec, right? Which to me means, and I think that's what Mr. Wood read it, that it's not addressed, right? Okay.
Chuck, talk.
Now, and we're just trying to get on the same page here, right? One of the things listed as not in the educational spec is nurses facility. Mr. Dwyer, you said, of course, nurses facilities, and it's just that it's the nurses facility as it exists today, or it's the same size it is today, or central administration and the Board of Education didn't see any need to redo the existing nurses facility. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but,
Basically correct.
okay. So, is it in the educational specification, or is it not in the educational specification?
Yes.
Okay, I was waiting for Mr. Flynn to complete. Chuck Warrington, I'm with Colliers International, we're the owner's project manager. This comparison, Mr. Quinn tasked me with putting together this side-by-side comparison as he understood it from the Board of Selectmen as a request, if I understand that correctly. I wasn't at the meeting. So what I did is I took both the ed specs, the black and white, printed them out, and objectively, not subjectively, we weren't part of the programming, that's the architect.
Right.
Just took them black and white for what was needed. And this is just a straight line-by-line comparison, as best we can, to compare up the two ed specs. OTPT, from what unless it's somewhere we missed it, which is always a possibility, was not in the list of rooms in the ed spec.
And the ed spec, just to be clear, it's not just about, and tell me if I'm wrong, because I know you will, the ed spec is about what the entire school is supposed to do, not just what the addition is supposed to do or what the renovation is supposed to do. So it should be an exact listing of the entire school, right?
That's what Riverfield was a comprehensive ed spec, and we weren't here to judge the ed specs against each other, just a comparison.
I understand.
Riverfield was comprehensive, said this is the complete program. And Holland Hill was, we call it an added. These are the spaces we need on top of what we have existing. So there's already an existing art room. It's already
Right.
in the building, and we know that. It just wasn't listed as a required space. So again, this is purely an objective, black and white, side by side with no
Right, so-
subjectivity.
So by that, in the ed spec for Holland Hill, there wasn't listed in the ed spec a need for a nurses facility. Obviously, there's a need for a nurses facility, but the Holland Hill ed spec didn't have it in there, to Mr. DeWitt's point.
That's correct.
All right, thank you for the
Just
clarification.
clarify, so,
And then I want to go right back to Mr. DeWitt.
That's not what,
right.
Mr. Dwyer just shook his head. The ed spec,
Dwyer just said the ed spec is the entirety of the school, not whether they think it's adequate or not adequate. It's the entirety of the school.
I apologize for interrupting all this, but
Use the mic.
Well,
the
go
ed
ahead,
spec is
Mr.
supposed to
just-
say
so-
Holland
so-
Hill School has X number of bathrooms, X number of exits, X number of ADA compliant walkways. It's not just, I'm going to change the nurse's station from nurse to not. It's the whole thing. It's the spec. When you're done, you should be able to walk around with it and say, 3 bathrooms, 4 doors, right? That's what the ed spec is supposed to be, my understanding.
general ed spec.
Well, isn't that
My
what you said?
understanding, as
I
I've
think
been...
that's what you just said.
No, no, the ed spec says here are the things that we need that are not in the building. It does not go through all of the entire building and say, we have hallways, so still have the hallways, we have bathrooms, still have the we have a health
That's
suit.
not what I understood you to have
No,
said, so thank
that-
you, Mr. Mayor.
Correct.
Because I understood you to say it's supposed to be
No.
the entirety of the building to deliver the program. That's what the
To meet the
educational-
deficiencies, correct.
No, not
Yeah,
deficiencies.
so
The
my
entirety of the
apology
program.
if I didn't answer the question specific enough. It's to meet the requirements, the new requirements that we have for that building. It is not intended to go through the entire building and say, here's what is existing, it should stay existing.
Not that it says that it's existing, just to say at the end of the day, the school should be this to deliver the entire program.
And the ed specs only cover what should be new, not what is existing.
The ed specs only cover what's to be new. That's a different answer, but that's the
Yeah.
answer, is the ed specs are only to
That's-
do what's new. Okay.
So, if
Not- And not new construction, but, whatever spaces are needed to be renovated, renovate to accomplish that
New
space.
construction.
To accomplish the deficiencies.
Fine.
Whether that's enrollment,
Fine.
program deficiency, or life safety.
Fine, that's different. Thank you. Mrs. Marmon.
So-
can
Oh, go
may I
ahead.
just finish that one
I
point?
think it's just a follow-up.
Oh, okay, so's mine.
Just,
Okay.
is it a follow-up
It's,
on
it
it?
is a follow-up. It's a follow-up actually on these resource rooms. I'm getting confused. Are you looking at the resource rooms as an umbrella under which you can perhaps have OTPT going on? Is that what the resource rooms are for? Special ed, OTPT? Like, what are the resource rooms directed towards? Are they directed towards, for example, addressing the potential lack of an OTPT room?
The deficiencies come straight from the 2010 report, because probably and I'm just conjecturing, maybe in 2010, the OTPT was delivered within a classroom, and then as enrollment grew, those functions got pushed into spaces that they shouldn't be in. And so probably the ed spec was deficient in not specifically calling out OTPT, but certainly in consultation with our staff, that's clearly one of the goals that we had.
I guess I guess I'll direct it towards the building committee then, because you came up with these resource rooms based on discussions, I thought, with the principal and others. What were the resource rooms, what did they want them dedicated towards?
We went
Or am I
through,
missing something?
with the principal and the architect, the school social worker, school psychologist, math, science, special ed. We went through and specifically outlined what programs needed spaces.
Okay, and you came up with a total of 4 that you needed that would meet those
Well,
needs?
instructional improvement, there's a whole list. That's chart B2.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so OT and PT were not included in one of those resource rooms, is my question.
No, that was separate. That was separate.
Okay.
Okay. I'm going to go back to Mr. DeWitt, because he's been patient, and thank you, Mr. DeWitt, for letting me co-opt your question.
No, it's good discussion. My last point, just this this nurses facility that was not in the ed spec, though, if you look on this chart that the gentleman from Colliers put together, which is great, it does clearly drive changes, because it says the nurses' support space used to be in the hallway, and somebody didn't think that that was right, so it's driving a new room. That's the way I'm reading it, because there's a new health area suite. So, by not being in the ed spec, it's still driving change on this document.
The existing health suite at Holland Hill, you have one dedicated separate room that's probably 200, 250 square feet. Then the hallway immediately adjacent to that, they have some added support where I believe there's a refrigerator for medication in there, some storage cabinetry, a little closet, and also there's a little toilet room and a sink right off that hallway too, which may be shared by administration too, but it might also just share the health suite. I'm not 100% sure on how they use it, but that's kind of the health suite as it stands today.
Right.
So based on some discussions during programming and our experience at Riverfield as well as other schools we've done, the belief was that an expanded health suite would be appropriate.
And totally agree, and I think it reinforces Mr. Walsh's point. It appears on this piece of paper you're going to make it look just like Riverfield. Not the same square footage, not the same layout, but in functionality, right? Which is, I think, Mr. Walsh's overall point, and my overall point, whether I'm making it or not, is the ed spec should, for a 504 school, should have the same functionality. So, with that, I will
Thank you, Mr. Becker.
hand it off.
Thank you, Mr. DeWitt.
Thank you. So, a couple follow-ups, and then I'll jump into my stuff. But immediately, a question just on this health suite item. It seems interesting that it not be on the ed spec, and it not be made clear that something like that needed to be remedied and brought to the same level as a Riverfield directly from the Board of Education. Because that, to me, it seems like the type of thing that you guys immediately walk through and go, whoa, that needs to be changed.
And
so it just sort of surprises me.
One point on the health suite, just to be fair, it does still have to be vetted with the town health department, which we're going to get to as the project moves forward in design development, but this was our first bite at the apple, if you will.
Totally. But I'd even I want to make an assumption, but you would think that they'd even probably see the other thing and see your comparable and say, well, that's an improvement, right? Their whole goal is to keep making these things better. On the 504 conversation, I'm thinking back, I mean, there's been many conversations over the years, but if you go back, let's say it was around September, October of 2015 here, so a little over a year and a couple months. There was a lot of discussion about potentially redistricting and what to do, 504, not, all the different schools. And if I go back to that point, I think one of the things that came out, maybe not from everybody, but I think from a fair amount of people here, was that we wanted to go to these schools, we wanted to bring them to 504, we wanted to do all the necessary improvements in these schools to move on and not have to come back. We also wanted to do them as much of today's dollars and today's rates versus finding out 5 years from now that something wasn't done and now it costs us exponentially more. And I can think of one example being the auditorium at Fairfield Woods, which was, I think it was $500,000, then it was a couple million, and by the time we finally went and did it, after multiple renovations, it was $6 million maybe. I mean, it was definitely up there. And I think we were talking about trying to avoid those types of things. So I think when we look at all these different spaces and the direction from the Board of Education and looking to try to be, as much at parity with the other schools that we're going through, I think it seemed like that was sort of a directive that was sent out, maybe without a vote, but well over a year ago as to the 504 and what we want to see. To some extent, when you look at the ed spec, I will admit liking some things not always being on there, right? If you had said I want 130 spaces and it cost $5 million to blast to make 130 spaces, we'd be stuck with potential, other than adjusting it, 130 spaces, or we don't get our reimbursement done the right way. So I can respect being vague or speaking in some more general terms on certain areas. But it does seem like there's a big difference on the Riverfield. So I look at here on the Riverfield one speaks to, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but it talks about, 20 classrooms versus 5 added classrooms in the new in the new spec. So there's a difference there between being vague and talking about a final product versus talking about only what you want to add. And I think, if this is the way you're going to do it moving forward, maybe what you need to consider on the Board of Education, and I talked to Mr. Dwyer on this one, but as a Board of Education side, maybe there's some sort of a middle ground here between the way you used to do it, the way you want to do it, and where you really should be. Because there are way too many questions, and it leaves way too much up to us and the building committee, that I think potentially, lands us where we are here, and it could end up in the wrong direction. Well, look at that. There's 6 different spaces. They asked for 1, we're going to give them 3, because we think that that's better. And that's not the way it is. I mean, it is the Board of Education, ultimately, and central office to really to advise you guys and for you guys to make and the BOA that decision, and to tell us what you need in order to run this school. And to run it for not the next 10 years, but the next 20, 30, dare I say 40, but a long arc of not having to come back and divvy up space and do that. One question I do have in looking back at the, you guys put these out every year for the capital, it's your facilities plan. So when you do these facility plans, when you go out, I'm looking at the Holland Hill one, it does note in dollars, but I'm looking at it, and if we're talking, one error I'm finding is when you talk about the years, it looks like the years you're using on some of the projects are more when they start going through or maybe midway through the process, but not necessarily the year you're actually planning to bid. So maybe you can explain where what sort of increase factors you're putting in there. Because obviously when you're doing this, from the way I'm reading this, you do put some inflationary factor into this. And I ask that because it does roll up into the waterfall, and I think this is a point in watching the Board of Selectmen meeting. One of the issues that we're facing here is that there's another, beyond all the smaller and mid-sized projects, there's another really big renovation to another elementary school that is going to have some variation of the problems of these other buildings wrapped into it, and that's going to be Mill Hill. And if that project, which is already slated for a higher dollar amount in the waterfall, goes up even more, and then the inflationary factors are off and all these other things, it has a massive ripple effect all the way through the town and the Board of Education waterfall and all of the projects and all the different things that we need to do. And we're also entering an environment where the interest rates are starting to go up. And I know that that's been talked about for years, getting some of these things done now and not having that hit. And that's starting to trickle in. And, I would expect by the time we get to Mill Hill, we're going to see that effect. And that's...
Did you have a question?
Well, yeah, no, I do. Yes, I would like to understand better how they're adding in this construction inflation in the numbers, if they're factoring in, obviously, this, the potential on the interest rate side, and let's start there. So that's the biggest thing, because I'm looking at the book, and I'm looking at both of these projects, and they speak to this number, but they're still way off.
I'll ask Tom Cullen, our Director of Operations, to correct me if I'm wrong. I think he used a 3% inflation factor, and I think that he... Annually? Correct. And I believe that the inflation factor is through to when the project is approved, not necessarily when it is constructed. That I'm not... Yeah. And so if we assume that it's going to be approved in 16 or 17, it's inflated to that number, not to when the bid will go out, because the approval process for these projects takes a long time, and it's you'd have to say, well, let's guess another 2 years beyond the approval date. Excuse me. and just add that to it for safety's sake.
So we know that's under, right? Because you're using 4% on this, 3% on that. We're using it through construction time.
Yeah, we're using 3%, they used 4%. We did it through approval date, they're doing it through construction date.
So
Yeah,
you could be as much as 10% off.
but
Well,
inflation and all that, right, correct.
That's just it. You're at 2 years at 3%, where we're really at 4 years
Yeah.
at 4%.
No, and it...
So looking at the book, all the numbers and the parentheses of X dollars, for the larger projects at least, they're all off, and they're all off by a fair amount.
Yeah, and we could add 2 years to the approval date and then calculate the inflation accordingly. And if somebody wanted to say, what's the exact inflation rate that we ought to be using, if our 3% is considered low or the 4% is considered high, find a number that the town thinks this is a comfortable number to use.
Anything else, Dave?
On the request side, I think that, and it doesn't necessarily play directly into the Holland Hill approval, but the fact that we just went through a capital planning workshop, we're handed documents, and are supposed to be looking at these waterfalls when we make these approvals, and what you're saying means essentially that any of the larger or middle or medium-sized projects are wrong, and upwards, just thinking of Holland Hill and Mill Hill, that's at least $2.5 million right off the bat. I'd like to request that some of these documents be revised and we get that updated information, certainly prior to whenever you're going to come back for any sort of dollars related to these things, and preferably with some lead time, because that's, I think, going to be a fair amount to digest and the potential ripple effects.
And I'd say that really this fall is the best, in the next capital planning workshop is probably the best time to come back with revised numbers, only that our staff have a new superintendent and we have a school to run, and so to put this project any sooner than that, you know, I would hope that the Board of Finance would say, yeah, that's probably an appropriate time, because we don't have, other than this project, the other major project is several years out. So if that fits the Board of Finance's schedule, that would be appreciated.
Yes.
I'm okay for now, then.
Jim?
Okay.
Mr. Brown?
Really to Mr. Mayor, there's some ominous signs with our state budget. And what I read in the Fairfield Citizen, I believe, they're looking for $1 billion in reduction. Thank you. So we have to also take into consideration with this project and any future projects, there may not be that reimbursement from the state. And I don't know if there's any information we can get on that as we go through this process from our state reps, or are you talking to anybody?
I have. That issue with respect to future reimbursement for construction projects is on my plate, and I am in discussion trying to find out if I can, trying to see if I can find out any information. The next waterfall that we produce will probably have some sensitivity testing in. If we don't have any further information, we'll have sensitivity testing with what it's been historically, what it might be in the middle, and what it might be at zero.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea.
Can I add to that, if I might?
Yeah.
I got a call today from Tony Wong telling me that there is a major push up in Hartford to reduce, to your point, to school reimbursement. And he went on to tell me that Greenwich is taking it in the back of the neck significantly. And so he said that just passing that on as information.
I had heard very similar. Mr. Walsh, you have been waiting patiently.
Which then kind of drives what I just want to talk about, which is these ed specs need to be tightened up, depending on what the Board of Ed wants to do. We only have limited dollars in this town, and the ed specs drive that budget. Whether how many classrooms, how many rooms in general, how many resource rooms, it drives the budget, and these need to be fleshed out. They should have been fleshed out earlier based on a 504 model. I'm not sure where they weren't, but these need to be fleshed out by the time we next see this, because it's putting too much discretion on the building committee from talking to a principal about what would work best for them and their school, as opposed to what is best for the programming and what is best for this town for a building we are going to be basically paying to be built. So I think a lot of work needs to be done on this at the Board of Education level to flesh out what they want. Because if you don't think that they should have a nursing area as big as they seem to have planned it to be, because you want to have it's more important that you have a 504 school, you got to let them know that. Because there's only limited dollars here. There's not $21 million. There just isn't. And especially if we're hearing this stuff from Representative Huang, the committee. I mean, there just isn't, because it'll push other programs way far out. Because if that Mill Hill project, we might as well start putting that number and changing that in the waterfall to above $20 million because of the site conditions that are at that site and how much it's going to cost to build. And we should probably look at that anyway during the next capital planning meeting on what's there right now and where it's going. Has there been a cost calculated for the differences between the original ed specs and the number where you are now?
Right. That was one of the questions.
That was one of the requests at the Board of Selectmen.
We haven't done that yet, no.
When will we have that?
I would assume in the next 7 days or so.
Okay. And if there's any additional number that would be considered to be an enhancement above what was in the original ed spec to something larger, I think we need to know that as well.
Can you flesh that out for me, please?
Yeah, if the original ed spec calls for something and you guys have expanded on that from talking to the principal, because they want, say it's not going to be 100 spots, but it's going to be 112 or 120 spots.
Okay.
I want to know what the difference in that cost is as well. That's what I would
You do
consider.
realize that we're spending a lot of resources after numbers that are going to change dramatically. Okay? So if you want us to do that, that's fine. But I'm telling you, we're coming up with a whole new schematic design based upon discussions. Yes?
I was waiting for you to get done, Mr. Quinn. I didn't mean to.
That's okay.
All right.
You're the
I was going
boss.
to suggest that Mr. Walsh, what you asked was what we'd also asked at the Board of Selectmen for anything above, any cost impact above the ed spec, that we priced out those changes so we could make a conscious decision about what was taking place. However, to Mr. Quinn's point, perhaps let them get to where they are going to be with a revised scope, and then have that same chart and same, so you get your question answered on what they're proposing to us, not what they're not going to propose to us.
Yeah, because I understand what Mr. Quinn's saying, that there's some cost involved in redoing this stuff. But that's why I think the Board of Ed has to get involved in this process. They have to get involved in it now, and so does central administration, to determine what their priorities are.
We met with them 7 days ago.
And they're fine with everything in here?
No.
Just
They was putting words in my mouth. What I said, we met with them to review the scope of the project.
Okay.
So, can we ask, in an effort to wrap this up, this has been very useful, and in fact, thank you for coming to us and alerting to us, or coming at our request, to talk to us, wow, twice in one night, I'm slipping, talk to us about the overages as currently presented. In an effort to cut that short, can you tell us what the next step in the process is for you?
The
What
next-
are you guys doing next?
What we're doing next is taking what we sat down with the central board about 6-7 days ago, whatever, and redoing the plan to understand what the impact would be.
Okay, so you're sitting down with central administration.
We already did that. What we're doing now is having the architect look at all the suggestions and putting it on paper so that we can measure what the impact will be.
And the discussions with central administration were about where you could cut back in order to.
Yes.
Have those discussions gone up to the Board of Education level? Do they
Only to Mr. Dwyer, who's on the committee as the rep.
So, Mr. Dwyer, what's your process so that we're aware with the Board of Education so that we understand this?
Our past practice has been that as long as the building committee delivers the ed specs, if they deliver something beyond the ed specs, they don't have to ask our permission. The only time they have to come back to us specifically is if they want to eliminate. So, for instance, our general statement of additional parking, that if we had put in a number and they had to come in 5 spaces less, they would have had to come back to us. And so they only come back to us either for one of two things: a general update, simply because they want the board to be informed, or they want to change the ed specs because they can't deliver on them. Those are the only two instances.
So that's what used to happen.
Yeah, correct.
Right, I get it. So now we have a building that's before us that numbers we're hearing to satisfy the ed spec and such is 21 million, based on an original estimate of 13 million. Does that change your process with the Board of Education in any way, given the magnitude of the difference in the number?
The building committee doesn't report to the Board of Ed, and so if we wanted to, within their commissioning of a building committee, say that if it's whatever, before they come to other bodies to ask for more money, they first have to come to the Board of Ed. I guess you could change that, but at the moment, the building committees don't report to the Board of Education.
I would think.
So it can work any way you want.
Right. I would think that we would want the Board of Education fully on board in any changes that are made so that this school can be built to a level that will support the program, but that is economically feasible.
And
Mr. Mottola?
Just to clarify something you said and make sure I understand it. When you said the number to satisfy the ed spec is $21 million, isn't the real question should be the number to satisfy the specific Riverfield school ed spec is $21 million? Isn't that really
I have
$21 million? Well, that's my understanding of it.
No, that's not accurate.
Okay.
Based on, because they've already identified that there are additional things in here over and above the ed spec.
Right.
And over and above Riverfield.
Oh, I guess.
Gotcha.
I want the Board of Education to sign off on what
Oh,
we're building.
let's-
And, and say, yeah, that satisfies, we're comfortable with that, right? And get it priced. Go ahead, Mr. Tetra.
I think one of the questions was, were there things in Riverfield that were over and above the ed spec?
Right.
Did it take more than that to do that? Because we didn't quite ask that question or look at it quite that way during that process. So that from Mr. Flynn, going back to your point, I think that you want and I think we want to work with the Board of Ed so it's more of an iterative process. So certainly anything less, they're currently required to go back to the Board of Ed. But I would argue anything more, because once you start adding more, you're now multiplying that times 14 other schools in town.
Right.
And saying you have to keep everybody equal or fair or within some reasonable range. So there's a certain scope inflation that starts to happen as part of this. But also argue that at some point, we need to have somebody sit down and review what we're planning to make sure that we understand which of the costs that's included, and specifically if anything extra's been included, as to whether that's eligible for reimbursement. We're talking about the rate of reimbursement, but I'd like to have somebody review this to make sure that some of these extras are not knocking us out of the blocks for any reimbursement.
And I think the discussion needs to be put in a broader context, and I think Mr. Becker spoke to it a little bit, Mr. Brown did, Mr. Walsh did. This board is committed to seeing that Holland Hill is renovated, and there needs to be some level of addition there to support the current programs of the 21st century. I think we all recognize that. I think we're dealing with a situation of, Mr. Quinn, you put it right at the top, A, sticker shock, and B, changing economic circumstances, whether it be state reimbursements, of which, quite frankly, we don't know what we can count on. As well as, Mr. Dwyer, we talked about this, the long list of waterfall items that fall into place right after this. And it's not an endless supply of money. And to the extent that this goes over the 13 million that was allotted for it, it pushes some other school project back into the more distant future. And I think we just need to be cognizant of that. So I think there's a lot of heavy lifting to be done here in looking at what the appropriate build is, because, you know, I said earlier tonight the 21 million is unaffordable. It just is.
I know that. We know
I
that.
know you know that.
Yeah.
But I'm just stating that it's a perceptive grasp of the obvious that I have.
Yes, it is.
You know, 21 million is just not going to happen.
And to be fair, we talked about how this project fits in with other projects that are on the Board of Ed long-range plan at the Board of Selectmen meeting. Mr. Quinn definitely listened to that, as with the board, and I
sure.
think that's one of the things that drove their going back to look for how we reduce this and what can we do to meet the ed spec, but not cost as much money to the town. Not so much because one part's how it impacts this project, but it very definitely will impact other projects,
Well, and
as we've already seen.
And Mr. Tetron, that's what my point as well, and that's, Mr. Dwyer, that's why I say, whatever we do here, given the magnitude of the differential, I know personally I would feel much more comfortable if the Board of Education was in lockstep, knowing exactly what the plan was, and what they are going to get and are not going to get here, and what has to be pushed off from other projects, given any cost differential. Anybody have anything else? Mr. Hopkins?
Gentlemen, I just have a quick comment. I've listened to everybody this evening, and I just want to say that I think you're doing an excellent job, and I hope you're going to go forward with your work on your committee exactly the way you've been doing it. I think you've talked to all the appropriate people, had everybody involved. You had both the Board of Ed, you had the superintendent, and you've had the people at the school. All those people are appropriate to speak to, and I hope that you continue doing your work. I think you've done an excellent job here of what you've put forward, and it sounds like you've done an excellent job of looking into what the school really needs, and you've done an excellent job of looking into how you're going to reduce cost as much as possible. So that's what I hope continues, and I look forward to hearing what you have to come back with.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hopkins. Mr. Walsh, did you have anything else? I thought I saw your hand. All right. Mr. DeWitt, please.
Just a quick update, Mr. Chairman. Quinn.
That's me.
So last February, we had a bond, $1.24 million.
That's included in the cost. That's included in the cost.
I'm just curious.
Yeah.
So that was for 2 temporary classrooms and
The portables.
Portables, yeah. How much of that is spent to date?
Chuck, what's the
Full expenditure, we just paid for the initial.
I apologize. We just paid for the initial, I don't have our expense sheet, I'm looking at our budget, but we just paid for the initial installation and a couple months' worth of
rental?
Installation of the portables?
Yeah.
Yeah, the installation's I want to say it's around, I don't even want to speculate. The total budget for it's
$200,000.
It's $300,000 for the installation, the rental over a 36-month duration, the uninstallation at the end to take it down, and then there's some also miscellaneous IT and security that was included in the $300,000. We just got the initial payment. I don't recall off the top of my head.
But $300,000, you've got $940,000 of seed money. Is that right? You do the math in the
Well,
budget.
it's for the portables, yes. And it's fully budgeted, and we don't expect to go over.
Yeah, and that budget's through the design development phase, which would be the next phase once we, figure out the final program. Just high numbers, the architect's fees around $270,000 to go through DD, and our construction manager's about $130,000, project manager's about $100,000 of that. Just some of the bigger numbers to get us through the design development process.
Great, thank you.
All right.
Put a fine point on that, because when you say $1.2 million to put on 2 portables, I want to make sure both the community and the board understand
I
it.
said $1.24 million bond for 2 portables and seed money for the overall project.
Yes, right. I just wanted to put a clear point on that. $300,000 for the portables. The balance was to design this project. Yeah.
All right. Any others? Seeing none, we're going to wrap this part up. Mr. Quinn, do you have anything?
I just want to thank everybody for their support, and I really impress on you that you really need to get out and see Riverfield, okay? and make a judgment not only on the dollars and cents, but what has transpired at that school. Because I think you'll be very pleasantly surprised.
I know we will. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. We have another item. Oh, actually, my fault. We should have public comment on this item, so if there's anybody that has something to say and they want to say it quickly, please come forward, announce yourself, and go right ahead. You've been sitting patiently. And thank you, Mr. Brown, for reminding me. Anybody at all? All right. We're going to take a quick 5-minute recess, and then we're going to get back with our last item of the evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
As many of you are aware, late last week, we received notification from the state that they were making an adjustment to the current year budget. Now, this is the current year budget that started July 1st, 2016, and here we are in January of 2017. Now, it's not wholly unexpected. If you'll recall, when we went through the budget cycle last year, there was some talk about some latitude being given to the governor's office relative to municipal aid. And we had put in plan at the time contingency plans and discussions regarding what those amounts might be and how we might offset that. As late as November, we asked Mr. Mayor and Mr. Tetreault what the latest available information on it was, and we were told that we received the dollar amount that we had expected to receive in early October, and B, we had no further communication with the state that indicated that cuts were in the offing. That said, we got by the November election, and cuts are in the offing now, come the end of December. And I think the number is rounded $600,000 for this current fiscal year, and that's all related to educational costs. There's additional reductions in capital expenditures, correct, that is minimal impacting us right now, but maybe
I think
you
it's
two gentlemen
15,
can
the
walk us
additional
through.
LoCIP money that you're referring to is about $15,000, so
Right.
it's not a big item. ECS was the biggest part of that at $570,000.
570, thank you. I thought it was 590. So can we walk through, tell us what you know, tell us what the plans are. And of course, Mr. Mayor, it's going to be very important. I'm going to go back to a topic earlier this evening so that we don't have to belabor it. Any potential reduction in the percentage of reimbursement we get on school building projects, that's going to be critical to us as we move forward, as you well know. But go ahead, why don't you walk us through where we stand today?
So during the break, I laid a document on each of your places. This is an updated document that you're familiar with. We've started drafting, I guess, with the as soon as the budget process ended last year, actually. I think, you know, like, because we've always known we're going to have a variance, a negative variance in revenue, and how we're going to handle that. And we've had that partially with compensating adjustments, and we had some positives. So let me just go through the document briefly. You see that there's gray. The numbers that aren't gray are the exact same as the numbers you've seen in your prior. So I'm just going to briefly go over not briefly, but I'm just going to go over the gray numbers. So you see the first gray number is the $570,000. I'm not sure that $15,000 we're referring on LoCIP is real. It's not included here when I was looking at that today, but it's $15,000, and it's. But you know, we'll obviously add it if it's appropriate. So you see that the total known, because basically the you go down through the MRS. That's all known. The state reimbursable tax credit. That's one that has been on here before. That is, we have, you know, veterans and veterans exemptions and other exemptions that are state exemptions, separate from the town senior tax exemption program. We granted $499,000 credits through that program locally. We get a reimbursement of some of that money. We booked a reimbursement of $380,000. We got the check today. The check was $330,000. So that's an additional $50,000 shortfall. The potential motor vehicle at risk based upon the automobiles that were provided to us on our grant list from the state that we think might not be ours. You've seen that number at 417. You've seen it at 200. Looking at that and redoing that, which I actually do monthly, but did that actually today. Actually, the number came in the middle, $320,000. Investment income you've not seen on this list before because things were tracking pretty well, but we all know what happened to interest rates shortly after the election in the last month. So looking at the mark-to-market change compared to what we had budgeted, we're looking at potentially at this point, that could go up, that could go down. Looking at, though, potentially at this point, I'm estimating a negative $100,000. So we have a total revenue shortfall of $3,338,060. As you may, I'm sure you all remember, we're handling that from three different sources. The first one there is this fiscal year 16 expenditure carryovers. These were the budgeted items that were from fiscal year 2016 that this board voted to carry over into the 2017 budget. So those were a total of $1,877,000. Then we have the revenue adjustments, positive revenue adjustments. We had budgeted the senior tax relief as the same this year as last year, but when it came in $470,000 less. We actually just finished supplemental motor vehicle last week. Supplemental motor vehicle is positive. It came in at 86 or 89 million grand list amount instead of 72, I think was our initial, but the tax impact, $418,000 positive. The Parks and Rec you've seen before, there was an increase in fees, $200,000, and then the collection rate, 98.63 to 98.68. That's still on target, $125,000. So we have revenue adjustments of $1,213,000. And then we have the expenditure adjustments, and there are, these are known. The assessor, because we had fewer, I say they're known, I guess I estimated them based upon known information. But we have, the assessor, we had significantly fewer court filings this year than was budgeted for, which saves us, so that's not assessor, that's accessor, from the assessor's budget, expert witnesses and the like, and then the legal costs that are associated with those. All but 3 of the court appeals have been approved, that's finalized. The average discount, if that's the right word, the average reduction was 7.06%. If the remaining 3, which are Bigelow, Coles, and a real estate company, BlackRock, if they come in at the same 7.06%, then we will be right on target with $130,000 that we estimated as a credit from those.
What's the real estate company on BlackRock?
I don't have that with me.
Could you send it to the chairman and disperse it to the rest of us?
You certainly will.
Thanks.
And then there's
Do you know, Mike?
and department head churn, if you will, for lack of a better term. That's the savings that we realized from the open positions when I was covering HR, purchasing, IT, and then plus there's a savings in there from Parks and Rec, and there's a savings in there from the tax collector. So that calculates out to about $90,000. So the total there is $205,000. So you have total compensating adjustments, $3,295,000. I want to go back up to one other item. Under the compensating adjustments, the second item there, excuse me, wrong, the fourth item there, my apologies. The Board of Ed, the $637,000. If you remember, that's what we anticipated was going to be left in the in their quote-unquote internal service fund.
Right.
I think I've said in the past that I think that's understated. I still think it's understated. And I think that number is going to actually go up. So I think there's some significant cushion in that number. That's one of my, by the next meeting, I'll know that number. In fact, I might even know it sooner. I get calls in, and I've started gathering the information so I can finalize that number pretty clearly. Now, if you remember also, and I'm sure you do, when we first put the original document together, before we had some of these positives, we had anticipated some additional savings. The three were DPW, $700,000. These were if necessary. There was 2 vehicles and paving. And then the library was in at $100,000 and the fire department in at $75,000. The administration has not released those. So in case there's more negatives or the collection rate gets off kilter or something negative happens, that $875,000 of potential expenditure adjustments is still been put on hold, remains on hold.
Okay. Questions from board members? We'll go to Ms. Walsh.
The department head churn, can you go over that? What is that $90,000 savings?
That is if you remember, we were without an HR director for a long time, purchasing director for a long time, IT director for a long time.
So we budgeted at full staff.
They were all budgeted at full staff.
And did you say something in there regards to the Parks and Rec?
Parks and Rec
director?
as well, that there's a savings there. There was, I don't remember, Jerry left, there was a payout there with his accrued vacation time and that type of thing, and then there's savings with the current person who's interim. I don't remember what the net is, though, but that's included in the calculation.
Mr. DeWitt, did you have that?
For next budget season, is this potential motor vehicle risk, are we going to be not discussing this in March? It's a fairly large topic at last year's because that's kind of when we found out about it, like the middle of budget season.
I have not followed up recently with the state to see where, the supplemental motor vehicle, which came in and we cleansed thoroughly car by car,
right,
seemed to be pretty well prepared and done. Didn't find a lot of problems. Okay. So from that perspective, I'd be hopeful. But I haven't really talked to anybody at the state to see what the regular dump is going to be on the original. But that will be one of the obviously one of the follow-up information pieces of follow-up we'll be looking at.
I'd like to thank you for my supplemental motor vehicle bill that came in yesterday. Nice way to start the new year.
No, I haven't seen it.
Today,
Maybe I didn't get one. Department head churn, without going into numbers, because I know it's a personnel issue, but with the subsequent hiring of the department heads we've already hired, are we pretty much on budget to what we were?
No, this is the savings.
No, I'm with you. I'm saying.
This is for the savings for this fiscal year.
Got it. But we hired an IT director, and so much was budgeted for his salary. Are we on track for those salaries for the remaining? So if we put $50,000 in the budget and he came in paying $75,000, we would be 25 behind. So I just want to make sure we're not eating up the $90,000 of savings that we took out of your hide with with increases in other salaries.
No, that's,
We're on,
we're on track.
beautiful, I'm good, thank you.
Mrs. Leclerc?
Could I ask you to clarify the Board of Ed number for the Internal Service Fund? When we had our audit committee meeting, we had talked about with the Internal Service Fund that we used the asset that we had to pay for part of the Board of Ed budget this year, and that we would end up the year at 0, but then it was going to come back around and go negative. How does this fit into there?
At June 30, 2016, the Board of Ed had an account balance in their portion of the Internal Service Fund. All right. I'm trying to remember exactly what the number was, but let's say it was $2 million, or I think 2 point, some number. Right. That number was used for, it might have even been more than actually. The number was, so that was on, now, on July 1, the Board of Ed no longer has an Internal Service Fund because they're no longer at risk. Internal Service Fund requires a risk activity to be a part of it because they're now fully insured, okay? So the funds that were in the Internal Service Fund got allocated to run out, to cover a portion of their health care costs, this year's budget, and the remaining balance comes over to the town.
And that's what this
And this amount is what comes over to the town. Now, that's background to your question, which is because that amount was in the Internal Service Fund, okay, and then used on July 1. So the Internal Service Fund at June 30, 2016 is down to, remember the $7 million, $8 million negative we had? Is down to about break even, but the amount that was used to come back to the town and to pay for this year's health care costs for the Board of Ed will come out of the town's Internal Service Fund. So that'll be a negative. So we'll have a bit of a flip for those amounts, offset hopefully by savings in our other, if we do better in our, like our workers' comp or our general liability and or the town's medical.
Okay, Mrs. Leclerc? Mr. DeWitt?
Just one more quick one. This might be a question for Mr. Tetral. The compensating adjustments, so those were all numbers that we had pushed forward, we as a body had pushed forward, and of course, the Board of Ed came up with that number. But there were, as you had mentioned, there were also potential savings. What's the process here? So if this number, if it works out just like it is here, our shortfall is only going to be $43,000. Are we never going to take advantage of any of the potential savings? So you mentioned $100,000 in the library. I'll just pick on the library for a second. Are we never going to take advantage of any of those potential savings because we've got the coverage in that expenditure carryover?
We're going to look at two things. One is that we're a long way from finishing the year. So
agree.
for that $100,000, we've currently asked the library not to spend that.
Right.
So it's sitting there not spent. All right, and we'll make the decision on whether we spend that later in this year, based on how the rest of the year goes, how much snow we get, to pick one potential complication, and also what things are looking like. Have we lost any other money from the state? The state isn't bound to only make adjustments once a year. I don't know whose mic that is, but if you remember, and not that you should, but there were adjustments the state made last May and June that impacted towns, not us, fortunately, but they did impact other towns in last year's fiscal year. So they had to catch up for that money between then and June 30th. So we'll make that decision formally later as to whether to spend that or whether we need it for other uses.
That's not my question. Maybe I'm not being clear.
Okay.
and again, I'll just pick on the library. If there is a potential savings in the library, $100,000, I don't know what it is. What's the process that says we're going to use, are we always going to use this expenditure carryover before we dip into any other budget? Is that the process?
Okay, this money is different than the $100,000 in the library,
No.
so I'm not,
If we have to, we put money aside.
we didn't put it aside. Here's what we.
Push this money, is called compensating adjustments. That money was put forth by this board, just in case this happened. If it, I don't know why you're looking at me like that.
Yeah, but Chris.
Am I inaccurate? Am I saying that?
No, you're right, but it's a separate issue than the 100,000. What they're basically saying is within the library's budget.
Right.
Take, for example, their materials.
Right.
The administration has gone to the library and said, we know we gave you $650,000 to spend on materials.
Right.
Due to what's going on with the state,
Right, don't spend $100,000.
don't spend 100,000 of it, period.
Right.
And then at some point between now and year end, when there's more clarity over the unknowables right now, snow and sadly the state, the administration can go back to the library and
Hold on.
say, spend 50 of the 100, or you can spend the entire 100. Is that a fair, what is that?
correct.
Yeah, okay.
Does that answer? your
No, it's a different question, but it's
then
fine.
Go ahead, no, I want to make
No,
sure.
I guess what I'm saying is, we put forth a number, basically, let's put it this way. We put in storage $1.877 million, just in case. Then there were additional numbers that were thrown at us that were potential savings in the budget, just in case that 1.8 didn't cover. If we hadn't put that 1.8 million aside, it would have gone to the bottom line, right? Fair statement. If there's a real savings, and I'm only picking on library, but if there's a real savings in the library of 100,000, is there some process that says, I'll pull that 100,000 out of the library, put it toward the debt, and then put 100,000 of this expenditure carryover right back to the bottom line?
Well, the bottom line is kind of passed, because that's for last year, right? So this is money from last year's
Okay, well, I'll take it as the
surplus.
bottom line for next year.
Well, that's what you-
And that's the question of where we're going to be, because
Okay.
when we put this package together of compensating adjustments, we're looking at a $4 million reduction in revenue from the state.
remember,
So that's what we're trying to address. We didn't know what additional numbers we'd get hit with. We didn't know what our operating, again, we didn't know how much snow we'd get and how much overtime we'd have. And so right now, that's what we've carried over from last year to help with this year. And if we don't use it, it would go to the bottom line.
Okay.
All right, and two of those,
To next year,
That's my point, right.
which is where you're going.
Right,
You can continue to carry.
right, exactly. Thank you.
and so that's, yeah. And
That was your question, right?
so that's part of our planning process as we go through the budget process.
Well, and netting out if basically $43,000 isn't really going to work either. I mean, we technically could, right, as long as we break even, but we typically try to run a little bit of a surplus, and we try not to, when everything shakes out, leave you too close at the end, right? So if all of this stays, you're going to want some of that cushion in some of those departments, or unless some other knowns come in, right? You're not going to want to release all that and say, everybody spend it and run really close to whether you're going to net out.
All depends on where we are in June, and we don't have to decide to release that money till June for the most part.
Because most of this is going to be
And if you look
purchase type
at,
items.
if you go back and look at the last few years where we've run surpluses,
Mhm.
a significant amount of the surplus has been due to excess revenues.
Yep.
And we're very concerned about whether we'll have excess revenues in the next few years.
Yep.
So our our expense budgets have come in relatively close to budget, plus or minus a few $100,000, but on a $294 million budget, that's relatively close to zero.
Are you
I
good,
do have
Dave?
one question.
Sure.
And this is related to, I guess, into BOE. Just in, I see, it's all town side except for the insurance component. These are, education costs. I get that they're on the town side, and
Yeah.
I get that we have traditionally said they're not direct hits one way or another, whether they're higher or lower to BOE. But is there any sort, either you or we can ask them directly since they're here, but has there been discussion on whether or not there are some savings starting to take place over on the BOE side?
Are you intentionally throwing salt in the wound?
So.
Go ahead.
Two things. One, if you remember during the spring budget session, we kind of pushed through the budget before we knew what these numbers were and approved the mill rate. So once we do that, the Board of Ed expense budget is locked in. So then by state statute, we are not allowed to go back and adjust that, or unilaterally take that.
Yeah.
We do talk with the Board of Ed certainly, and Dr. Jones and I had a conversation earlier today as to where this stood and where we'd be, and how we might work together on, actually we've had a couple of discussions along those lines, working together on shared expenses type of thing. But I believe the Board of Ed has some ongoing concerns with their expense budget and some special ed costs that are causing them concern looking forward. So at the moment, there's not an easy excess cost number that they have.
Okay.
Mike, I thought you told me that Dr. Jones agreed to give back $1 million.
Yeah.
Yeah, but that was just between us, Tom.
Oh, sorry.
I thought it was 2.
It was a welcome
Go with your
gift.
number, Mr. Dwyer.
Yeah, really.
And Mr.
Yeah.
Just sticking with the Board of Ed, has there been any discussion with the state about excess cost and that formula for this year, that it might affect us this year?
Come on up.
Thank you. That's a very preliminary question. Tony Jones, School Superintendent. That is a very preliminary question for us. The discussions are just starting, and that is something that I had spoken with Mr. Tetro about, and that we do have concerns. That
Have they
there
given
could be
you
a
any, they're preliminary, but what have they said?
Right now, we've only been put on notice on one component, and that has to do with students who are in residential placement. And they have said possibility to pass that cost back to the local level could be on the horizon, and that is literally all they have said. And that to us could mean around $1 million, $1.5 million just for residential placement. Yes, that we don't pay for at this time. That's different than the excess cost, which we are also watching right now, and we're hopeful that they will not reduce that, but we anticipate we could see some reductions there. We'll know that number closer in February.
So the excess cost is a formula, right?
Yes.
And they're looking at taking that formula and changing how they look at that formula for this year?
They determine ultimately on excess cost how they're going to apply that formula, and so there is some flexibility in what they will provide and not provide, and we're watching that right now because we do think that they may make an adjustment there. But I can't tell you after 5 weeks that I can quote you the formula tonight, but yeah.
Okay.
But preliminarily, you're being advised that we could already be $1 million down.
We are watching it very carefully right now, and we would expect with what's happening at the state level, it does seem with education costs that while they're looking for dollars at the state level, they're being pushed down to the local level, and we would expect that it's highly likely that could happen with some of our special education costs.
Okay.
So that would be, in addition to a reduction in ECS, that would be $1 million reduction in, basically an increase in
It could be,
cost.
yes.
Preliminary discussions, I understand. Any idea, thoughts? I mean, we're already halfway through the year on when they may get back to you?
No, I mean, I wish I could say that. On the residential aspect, I can say that the Connecticut Superintendent's Association is involved as well, trying to have a strong voice there to let them know at the state level what it means to push those costs down to the local level. But that really is the extent of it at this time.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other questions while we have the superintendent here?
Yeah.
Yeah, Mr.
As
Wall?
we are sitting here today, how does your budget look?
Looks
Expenses
great.
concurrently to,
Well, we're going through every line item right now in preparation for my presentation on Tuesday night. And we are trying to be as prudent and thoughtful as possible, which I've also shared that with Mr. Tetro, in making sure that we're looking at the big drivers, which they always are in school budget. It's salaries and benefits. And we have little flexibility in most of that area. And we are trying to be extremely thoughtful and not add, new programs and additional costs this year. And it kind of goes along with the construction discussion you had just about wants. We're not building a budget based on want at all. We're working right now to have a budget based on need.
How about your capital budgets? Are they spent? Where do you stand on your capital budgets? Because those are budgets that could be frozen.
Oh, you're talking about current. Are you talking
Yes,
about current?
just current
I'm
budget.
sorry, I thought you meant building next year's. Current budget right now is a challenge. When I started 5 weeks ago, we felt as though we were in the hole about 1.2 million right now. And part of that had to do with where we stood at the beginning of the year when we had to hire additional staff above and beyond what was in the budget. And it was several teachers that were needed for classroom enrollment. And once we took that into consideration, as well as some of these excess costs that we're seeing in special education, for instance, tuition, we're watching all of those. We've managed to, I think similar to what they were talking about with the town budget, in their departments, freezing as much as we can, and we feel like we're closing that gap right now, but it's a very tight budget as of today in current expenses.
Dr. Jones, I thought those costs for those additional teachers was covered by the additional number, pretty large number of excess retirements that we had and the savings that we had off of them. At least that's what was represented by the gentleman who was served in the position on an interim basis before you.
Yeah, I would have to...
Is that not accurate?
It wouldn't be fully accurate because even though there's a difference in the number of retirements, with some of those retirements, your calculation cost is about $35,000 is what you save. Because if somebody retires and they're a first grade teacher, we really needed another first grade teacher. So it's not the full cost of a teacher. And we have gone in and calculated that, and that's taking everything into consideration. So there's some savings there that you get from those retirements that were above and beyond where we were last year. And I will say that's one thing going into FY18 budget. We're trying to have a better methodology for how we actually calculate our retirements, because that is a question I've had several times since I've been here.
Would you be able to provide us those numbers in regards to the number of retirements and the savings at $35,000 and the number of new hires that you had to make at the beginning of the year?
Sure. I mean, that's...
I'd like to see it because that's not what was being represented to us earlier within the last 3 months.
And you're currently working to manage $1 million hole in your budget this year?
That's correct.
And that's the first we're hearing about $1 million hole.
Yeah.
And
believe that's
that's
right.
solely by those teachers that were...
No, that's not solely by teachers. So, well, and I...
Give us the other areas that
Yeah, and let me just tell you, I didn't come prepared tonight to talk about the current budget, so I apologize if that's how this meeting normally... I would like to have numbers in front of me so that I don't give you an inaccurate number. I can tell you within that gap, there are several different drivers. The teachers, the additional staff, it's also paras. When we say staff, we have to add paras according to the student need, and we've had quite a few of those this year as well. And then on top of that, we have some additional cost drivers in special education. Tuition is another one that is up, and it will be up in the FY18 budget again. So, but I would rather give you actual data, and I'm certainly happy to email that to you so you have correct numbers.
What I'm concerned about, Mr. Chairman, is that we had a quarterly not too long ago.
Yep.
Where we had detailed information and a complete write-up by your staff, your financial staff. This $1 million not there. It's simply not there. So this is kind of like a shock on top of the state's taking $570,000.
What was that meeting, November?
Yeah.
Well, the only thing that was discussed was that there were 18 total heads that were not in the budget.
Correct.
That doesn't seem to make $1 million, though. Those are pretty high pay.
Yeah, that's why I would
the
have to
only
bring
thing
that
we
back to
discussed,
you
though.
to let you know.
But that we got a rosy picture back in November.
There was some discussion about staffing. In
Yeah.
fairness, there was some
Yeah,
discussion
that's
about
right.
staffing. I think the special education stuff that you're talking about, is a little bit more of a surprise. I don't have the documents in front of me. There was something about staffing. I don't remember the $1 million. I do remember the conversation about staffing, though. Others are shaking their heads.
Yeah, and I will say special education tuition is something that is a moving target. And when you start in September, you can have a student who is, outplaced in September, October, November, December, and those costs do change, and tuition does increase almost on an annual basis. But that is a moving target in many ways. It's difficult to calculate in September.
Do you have anything else?
Yes, I do. If you can give us also where you stand on your capital budgets for this year, how much is spent, and provide them, and what's spent versus what's not spent, that'd be appreciated. Because we're going through some significant stress. Phil, at an RTM meeting, I think it was right around the budget season when this whole situation with the state was coming up, you had said that the Board of Ed would certainly participate in any shortfall in the revenue. And yet, when Mike gives a list of $875,000 he's holding to the side, not having spent, I'm not hearing a similar anything on your side. Is there anything being held back? Because I
Mr.
don't
Walsh,
know.
if I might,
Yeah.
for clarification, if you look in the middle of this sheet, under compensating adjustments, there's BOE 637.
That was explained as the insurance.
Right, and that was what the BOE had talked about from day one
Right.
in terms of contributing back to the town. I just wanted, I didn't mean to interrupt you other than just to clarify what that number was. We had talked about that in the spring of being almost 900,000. When it eventually came through in August, it was about 637. But that was a number that had been part of our analysis when we looked at how to handle the $4 million shortfall.
What's going on to handle the $1 million
So I
issue?
didn't mean to distract you other than that, Jim.
I
just wanted to
didn't know it was just the savings in the BOE, which I think we kind of knew there was going to be some savings from full discussions with Mr. Mayor about that beforehand. I was thinking when I'm hearing that there was going to be, if there was a shortfall, further shortfall,
Well,
there'd be
to your
additional
point-
participation
And
and
to your point, they've got a $1 million
meaning.
They've got $1 million shortfall, right? So what are you doing to manage that right now? I mean,
In the-
same thing.
So if, let me give it back to you.
No, I want to,
Well,
no,
I'm
I
just,
want to know how you're managing.
I want to know how they've managed that all along, is what kind of what I want.
And at the time I gave that answer was related to the known cut for ECS, that we would contribute the balance that is in that account. We did not know about the $20 million allowance to the governor to find money savings, and we certainly did not know that he would take that entire $20 million out of education. So I wasn't commenting in light of the future action, I was only commenting on, in light of the current ECS. But your question is, where has the $1 million that we're trying to save
Well,
at the moment?
I'm saying, yeah, given that answer, you still have $1 million problem, you just said. So how are you managing that right now?
We did have 5 weeks ago, but we are freezing and going through a very similar process to what the town is doing, it sounds like, with their departments, and freezing everything that we can, not doing certain projects, and we're working through that. And as of today, we were closing that gap by freezing things, underspending in accounts to freeze.
There were some monies that were moved forward. There were things that were purchased last year in last year's budget, correct?
Mainly the textbooks, I think, is what,
How much was that?
right around 400,000 was pre-purchased last spring.
And you're using that to help cover some of this shortfall?
We had, the textbooks that we were purchasing, we knew were going to cost, and again, this is not an exact number because I don't have the numbers in
Yeah,
front of
yeah,
me, about $650,000. And Dr. Title, I think, knew in the budget this year we only had 400, had the opportunity to pre-purchase 400 of that last year. This school year, we paid the remaining 250. The additional of that 400 was going to be used for some social studies text. We've frozen that. So that's about 100 and, I want to say 110, 130,000 of this amount we're talking about that we have frozen.
And I won't hold you to the exact number.
Okay,
I
thank you.
totally understand. Now, you just heard the new information that we got tonight, and you provided some of your own, so we're just it wasn't intended to be a full financial review. So-
Thank you.
Sure. Any other questions? Mr. Hopkins?
In addition to the textbooks, can you give us any more detail of any other issues where you're doing freezes and what other programs are going to be affected?
Mr. Collin has frozen some projects on the maintenance side, custodial side, and I would need to look at that list to know exactly which ones we froze. We've frozen textbooks, some other materials that we would generally buy for the school level we have frozen, but I could review that list. And
The textbook issue, as I recall from the budget season last year, that was being phased in over 2 years, was it not?
Well, basically by pre-purchasing last spring, because that was a line item in the budget that was around $400,000. So you can't purchase that $650 all at one time. So it's going to be a spring purchase, and then it would be a following year purchase. So in essence, it happened last spring and this fall instead
year
of
and
this
this year.
fall.
Okay.
Yes, and then next.
Okay, all right. So that's completed then?
That textbook cycle. With textbooks, every year, you're on a cycle, so you're looking at a different curriculum area. So textbooks are never quite finished, but I think you will see, when you see budget numbers this year, you'll see a difference, because that was a very large purchase for us, and mathematics materials were large for elementary.
All right.
They had told us that when they were going into it, that there was a big ramp up.
Right.
All right, thank you.
Anybody else?
Yeah, Mr. Mayor, on the sheet that we have before us, what do you see as the biggest risk factors? The biggest areas where things could change even and potentially get worse.
Yeah. Investment income.
But that would go up, by worst case, would you say that would be like a $100,000 swing or a $200,000 swing worse?
200.
200, okay.
Additional
Okay.
200.
All right.
The collection rate shouldn't be a problem. I mean, I looked at December 31 numbers today.
Mhm.
We're still on track there. The motor vehicle, I mean, it's looking, the numbers bounce around. We basically have if you look at the last prior 3-year adjustments to motor vehicle accounts from the original grand list to the net receivable, it's been an average of maybe $150,000, $160,000. We've already had adjustments this year because of the flow, because of the misinformation from the state, of about close to $500,000. And so look at what we need to meet our budget versus what we collected last year when we didn't have this problem, and the number kind of just matches. It just kind of fits in with the adjustment of the $320,000. So I'm thinking that's a good number, but it's hard to tell. I'm pretty positive we have a positive on the BOE surplus, the healthcare surplus. So
The big issue
so
is
that's it.
snow and contingency, right? I mean,
Yeah, and there's nothing. We haven't spent. Seems like I don't think we spent anything on contingency yet this year.
Yeah.
Something I want to spend on, but I can't remember what it is.
No, but seriously, I mean, to
Yeah.
Mr. Walsh's point, I mean, when you go down here, the unknowns are motor vehicle, investment income, collection rate, which you spoke to, and then really it comes down to snow and need for contingency.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, right now, I'm always nervous. I haven't looked at, unless I haven't looked at the revenue side. This is the expense side. So the revenue side, right, in my mind,
Yeah.
the revenue side would be a big issue because I'm just,
Are you or Mike, are you hearing, through any of the organizations you're in or through the state, hearing any risk of any additional revenue items that we're not even talking about here, that they're talking about right now to cover any type of shortfall?
In terms of specifics, no, but that's why I use
Yeah.
that example from last year where it was May, when they actually made some additional cuts.
Mm-hmm.
So until we have the money in hand, There's always some risk there. I mean, we all know the state doesn't have the money to cover their expenses. So the question is, where do they cut it from? We're hoping we get through this year without any other major adjustments. We're going to be listening very carefully to what our state delegation tells us, looking into the budget for next year in terms of what additional adjustments the state will be making as part of next year's budget.
But they're starting on that late, and this is the long session, correct?
Yes. This is a long session.
Yeah. Hell of a way to run a railroad.
Hopefully, they'll have a lot of discussion this year.
Yeah. Starting tomorrow. And we have to be very conservative.
But in terms of specifics, Mr. Walsh, to exactly address it, no, I haven't heard from that. We've spent, there's been a lot of discussion at the CCM level.
Yeah, that's what I knew you're on CCM, so I didn't know whether.
I spent part of the day today talking to Mark Boughton, Rudy Marconi in Ridgefield, Dave Martin in Stanford, Ben Blake and Jim Marpy, just to talk about the 570, what else they're hearing, what they're doing, that type of thing. So there's a lot of discussion going on informally as well as the formal discussions. There are recommendations CCM is going to make to the state assembly. Hopefully they will accept some of those in terms of both revenue issues and cost-sharing issues for the towns.
And I don't want to belabor this because I know we don't know the answers, but Dr. Jones, I know you're new. What are you hearing, if anything at all yet, from other superintendents in the state and how they're trying to manage this and what their boards are doing? Are you hearing anything yet?
No. Once we get together, our actual regional superintendents meet generally about monthly. When we all come together, those are the sort of issues we'll all be discussing.
When are those meetings happening?
The next one, I believe, might be in February. I'd have to look.
It's late.
Yeah.
Be interesting to know what they're planning. Anybody else? Mr. Becker.
So, I don't necessarily want to put the ask out because I think it may be probably pretty lengthy, detailed, all that, but I think it may start to emerge during budget. It's come up before about all the mandates, and then we do the mandates because we're getting the money, but the fact that we're starting to not get the money, but then we're doing things because we're getting the money that we don't actually get anymore. At what point do we start to look at how much we're following everything that the state, because we're getting squeezed from both sides. They're taking the money away, but they're always coming up with more stuff that we have to do to get the supposed money. And that goes for probably more so on the Board of Ed side, but also for the town side. And I think it would be helpful if the town and the Board of Ed started trying to piece some of that together, or if they haven't already, as we head into budget, because I think it's a worthwhile discussion of figuring out, where we start saying, no, we're not going to consistently do every single thing because it costs us so much money. We're getting to a point, we talked earlier this evening about the construction costs. At what point are we getting nothing from them? I don't see that being that far off. So I put that out there as we are still, I guess we're a week away for you guys kicking it off, which in theory kicks it off for us, but we're heading into budget, and I think that's going to be a topic. So much as also, if the ECS, as an example, it keeps dwindling further down, at what point do we have to start guarding ourselves, assuming it's not even going to exist? We know we walk around with a target on our back. We're one step away from being essentially where Greenwich was. I think they have almost nothing now. They were threatened with it, and now they.
That's a pretty nice nothing.
Yeah, but it's where I'm going. Percentage-wise, we're going to have nothing soon enough. So.
And the only, if I could, there are very few, quote, mandates that are funded by some government grant that if we don't get the grant, we don't have to deliver the services. Very, very few. If they didn't give us a penny for special ed, federal and state law would still require us to deliver those services. Whether they give us money for the anti-bullying program, because they don't, we still have to deliver those services. You know, a mandate is a long word for law, and so we do have to comply with the law relative to delivering education services, whether they give us the money or not.
And thank you for explaining that position on the BOE side a little bit more. I think where I'm starting to head with this, and this is probably not just those items, but on a broader picture, at some point, we as a town and BOE, we as one, need to say, and probably not just us, but others together, need to say enough is enough, and need to potentially stand up to the state. And it's great to go to our legislators, Republican or Democrat, but that doesn't seem to be having a massive effect, because this is happening all over the state, and they've got their problems, but they essentially, as I said, on both ends, just keep kind of dumping everything on us. And it's getting to, it's pretty close to its inflection point, if it hasn't already, certainly at the state, but it's gonna happen at the town side.
Do you guys look at, to Mr. Becker's point, do you guys look at some of these mandates and say, how much are they costing us, and do we believe they're worthwhile from a local level? The reason I ask is, the point is not invalid to sit there and say, okay, it's the law, right? But we're one of the top school districts in the state. And if a whole bunch of the school districts get together and say, you know what, you're squeezing me here, you're squeezing me here, we don't have this issue, but yet we have to spend $1 million a year fulfilling this silly thing that, quite frankly, doesn't impact us as a town, just because some legislature thought it would be a good idea to put it on the books 50 years ago. So we're just going to say, as the top 20 school districts in the state, we're kind of done with this specific thing. And if you want to come sue us because you have all the money in the world to come sue us, state of Connecticut, and you want to go after your top 10 school districts, go for it. When you really should be spending that time and effort on the school districts that are failing. I'm not saying I have the answer for it. I'm just saying that it's a worthwhile discussion. You can laugh all you want, but at the end of the day, you're going to have to cut services to fulfill silly mandates that we're not going to get paid for, because there's just not there's just not enough money to pay for it anymore.
Yeah, and I think to Mr. Dwyer's point, part of it is, when it is in law, there are some aspects of the mandates that legally we would want to comply with, any school district would. But I agree with what you're saying, and I think what you're talking about is what we just went through in Virginia. And we spent the last 2 years in Virginia with a superintendent's organization. We banded together as a state, worked with the School Board Association at the state level and the superintendent's organization to basically say we want to cut through the red tape, and it was to eliminate as many mandates as possible that really were putting stuff back to local control that weren't safety related or something that was really needed for students. And perhaps that's something we could look at and encouraging at the state level. And that did have an impact for us in Virginia.
I would think it would. Yeah, and again, I'm not talking special education.
Right.
I'm not talking, health safety things. I'm just talking the silly ones that you can look at as a bunch of superintendents and say, we're wasting a lot of money here that could be better spent.
And that's exactly where I'm going. Yeah, there are obviously things that we're not talking about touching.
Kind of like racial imbalancing.
But
Yeah.
You're going up there tomorrow?
And here we
That's
go.
tomorrow morning.
Good luck.
Good luck.
Thank you. Thank you.
When are we going to have a decision on the racial imbalancing plan that we submitted?
We are at the State Board of Education tomorrow morning, and it'll have one of three decisions. They will either approve the plan as it is, they will approve it with conditions, or they will not approve it. If it's not approved or approved with conditions, we'll be asked to bring back an amended version of some sort. It could be 30 days, 60 days, 90 days. Hopefully, we'll know that tomorrow.
Let us know.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Any other questions, comments, concerns from board members? Seeing none, we went a little over tonight. Thank you very much and welcome aboard.
Thank you.
Do I have a motion to adjourn? Mr. Brown, seconded by Mr. Becker. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed, abstentions? We're done. Good night, everybody.